Hey guys, tonight we travel back to the groves of ancient Greece, places filled not just with sunshine and cicadas, but with creatures that whisper, watch, and, occasionally, get cursed by gods with questionable decision-making skills. You're standing at the edge of a dense forest, its trees tall and twisting like old rumors. You hear water somewhere off to the left, trickling over stones. The air smells of thyme, pine resin, and maybe a little drama. You take your first step into the woods, and it's like walking into a warm pocket of time. The light changes. Softer. Dappled. You could almost believe the trees are listening. And maybe they are, because this isn't just any forest. This is nymph territory, specifically the territory of Echo, a mountain nymph with a voice like honey, and a habit of using it quite a lot. You probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in here if you hate small talk. Echo and her fellow nymphs are the original nature influencers. They're everywhere, peeking from behind rocks, splashing in streams, lounging on moss like it's a spa day. But Echo, she's different. She's got charm, wit, and the rare gift of being able to talk her way out of anything, until she doesn't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere across the world, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where this sleepy little stream reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The leaves shift above you, making the kind of rustling that sounds suspiciously like whispered laughter. There's a cool breeze on your cheek, and the feeling that someone, or something, is walking just out of sight. It's not spooky, well, maybe a little, but it's mostly comforting. You're not alone, in a good way, because the Greek world is alive. Not just metaphorically. Every stream, every tree, every hollow in the rock is inhabited by some divine fragment of nature. And the ones who chat the most? That's the nymphs. They're not quite goddesses, more like eternal interns of nature, overseeing the daily operations of mountains, forests, rivers, and grottos. Echo, an Oread or mountain nymph, is particularly well known not for her silence, as you might expect, but for the exact opposite. Imagine the friend who always fills awkward silences, who narrates her own actions, and who always knows what's going on with everyone and everything. She's basically a walking forest update. Now picture her watching over Zeus, king of the gods, who's once again gallivanting through the mortal realm looking for, let's say, companionship. Zeus, you'll find, has a hobby of disguising himself and mingling where he probably shouldn't. And Hera, his wife, queen of the gods, is understandably suspicious. Eternally. You might say she has good reason. Echo, for reasons still debated by scholars, decides to help Zeus out. Not by hiding him, but by doing what she does best, talking. So, when Hera storms down from Olympus, nostrils flaring and eyes narrowed, Echo intercepts her with a dazzling array of distracting chatter. "Oh, Hera, you look simply radiant today. Did you know the moss on these trees only grows clockwise during the winter solstice? Fascinating, right? Oh, and I simply must tell you about the new grove of figs that's opened up near the southern slope." By the time Echo's finished, Zeus is long gone. For a while, this works. Every time Hera arrives, Echo meets her with a bouquet of delightful trivia, forest weather updates, and semi-flattering small talk. But Hera, immortal though she may be, is not infinitely patient. And so one day, after another one of Echo's long-winded distractions, Hera finally has enough. She doesn't yell, she doesn't throw thunder. Hera is far too elegant for that. No, she simply casts a curse. A quiet one, but devastating. "From this moment on," Hera declares, "you shall have the last word, Echo, but never the first." Just like that, the forest quiets. Echo opens her mouth, Nothing comes. She waits for Hera to leave, then tries again. Still nothing. It's only when a woodcutter passes by, muttering to himself, "What a long day," that Echo's mouth moves. "Long day," she says softly. That's all she can say, and it's as eerie as it is sad. The chattiest creature in the forest is now doomed to a life of echoing back others, never expressing her own thoughts first. Imagine always being one step behind in conversation. No hot takes, no forest gossip. Just reruns. Historians still argue whether this myth was meant as a cautionary tale about gossip or as a poetic explanation for why voices seem to bounce back from canyon walls. Either way, Echo's story resonates, literally and metaphorically. And as you walk deeper into the trees, you start to notice it too. Every footstep has a twin. Every sigh has an answer. The forest listens, and it remembers. You're walking now, deeper into the folds of that quiet forest, where sunlight slips through branches like whispers. The undergrowth is soft underfoot, mossy and uneven, with the faint scent of wet bark and violets. The breeze carries faint sounds. Maybe birds, maybe the faint echo of your own breath. And there she is again, Echo. But this time, not the mischievous chatterbox. This is Echo after Hera's curse. She's still there, watching from behind a tree trunk streaked with lichen, her face half hidden in the green. You try to say something, anything, and she repeats it back, a fraction softer, a beat slower, like a memory returning to you just as you're about to forget. Before the curse, Echo was known all throughout the mountains. She was not a minor player in the divine drama. She had presence. The Greeks didn't give nymphs sprawling origin stories. They were part of the world, like rain or fireflies. But Echo? Echo got attention. Her name, Echo, in Greek, doesn't mean she who echoes. It became the root of the word echo because of her. Language bent around her fate. That's how iconic she was. She wasn't the only Ored, of course. There were dozens, hundreds maybe, each guarding a hill or a crag or a wind-swept cliff. But Echo had charisma. She wasn't the kind of nymph who stayed tucked away in caves. She was curious, playful, and always at the center of things. Think of her as the unofficial MC of Mount Helicon. Her voice carried far and clear, so much so that some believed you could hear her in the ringing tones of mountain air. And if someone shouted your name in a canyon, and it came back to you, softer and distant, the ancient believed it wasn't just air bouncing off stone. It was echo, still lingering. Echo was a voice given shape, a sound that wandered long after its speaker had gone quiet. And of course she had friends. Oreds traveled in packs, or maybe you'd call it a grove. They weren't isolated hermits, but part of a lively, leafy social scene. They'd gather at springs to braid each other's hair, play chasing games through the shadows, and gossip. Oh, how they gossiped, about everything from nymph affairs to mortal blunders. That's part of what made Echo's gift so useful to Zeus. She knew everyone. If a satyr had gotten drunk and sung a ballad to a tree, Echo knew. If a shepherd's lamb had wandered too close to a sacred rock. Echo had already told 3 naiads by lunchtime. She was the vine, the whisper, the ever-present update feed. But Hera's curse didn't just quiet her. It rewired her very existence. Echo could no longer initiate. She couldn't even ask a simple question. Conversations became mimicry. Her identity flattened into reflection. Can you imagine? Living in a world of voices but unable to ever truly speak your mind. Scholars have spent centuries trying to puzzle out the moral here. Some suggest it's about the dangers of meddling. Don't get involved in affairs above your station. Others argue it's a lesson in the price of loyalty. And some, more whimsically, see it as the Greeks' attempt to explain the natural world. Why valleys talk back and caves repeat secrets. Of course, not everyone agrees Echo was purely fictional. In later Roman retellings, especially Ovid's Metamorphoses, she becomes a symbol of unrequited love and sorrow, her curse aligning with her heartache in ways that feel eerily human. And yet, even silenced, Echo lingers. Her presence didn't fade entirely. You can still feel her in those lonely places where your voice bounces back to you, just slightly changed. A faint mockery? A sign of companionship? Depends on the mood, maybe. You pause on the forest path. The air is still. You say something aloud, maybe your own name, just to see. And yes, there it is. Ghosting back. Name. It's comforting, somehow. Not frightening. Like someone's letting you know you're not alone. Remember, nymphs weren't bound by physical bodies the way mortals are. They were elusive, shimmery. They could vanish into trees, swim into the spray of a waterfall, or curl themselves into the wind. After the curse, Echo becomes more diffuse. Less person, more phenomenon. Her presence moves outward, beyond the single grove, into the world. That's why her name stuck. The ancient Greeks might have believed she faded from view, but in a strange twist, her story is one of the few myths that truly endured in scientific terminology. The word echo survives in almost every modern language. French, Russian, Japanese, even Swahili. It's not just a sound, it's her. She's become immortal, not in a golden chariot or a temple statue, but in the structure of our speech. A quiet goddess of repetition. In medieval manuscripts, monks often debated what voice really meant. Was it breath? A spirit? A soul? Some even speculated that echoes were lost voices of the dead trying to communicate. Others, more grounded but still poetic, imagined they were memories in the land, evidence that the earth listened. And always, always, Echo was there, trailing behind the voices of others, repeating them, softening them, giving them that dreamy, drifting quality. It's a strange thing, isn't it? To be remembered forever not by what you say, but by what you repeat. You walk on, leaves brushing your shoulder, the forest murmuring all around you. You say nothing, but something answers anyway. Anyway, the forest opens just a little, enough to let a sliver of moonlight spill down onto a clearing marked by smooth stones and low ferns. You step softly, the ground muffled with pine needles, as if the earth itself is trying to hush your footfalls. In the center of this quiet bowl of green is a spring, clear, still, and impossibly reflective. You approach it slowly, and suddenly it hits you. This is the place. Because tonight, dear traveler, we are not just tracing Echo's footsteps. We're also about to meet Narcissus. You've probably heard his name before, but not quite like this. Now, before we dive into his reflection, pun fully intended, imagine this. A young hunter wandering these same woods, known far and wide not for his hunting skills, nor his singing, nor his loyalty to the gods, but simply for being outrageously, unreasonably good-looking. That's Narcissus. The kind of beauty that makes shepherds drop their cheese wheels and naiads forget how to swim. His face is the original cause of more awkward silences than thunder. It's not even entirely his fault. Depending on which version you follow, he may have been blessed, cursed, or simply born with a face that makes everyone else question their life choices. So when Echo sees him, even in her silenced state, she feels something shift. She watches him pass through the trees like a silver coin rolling over moss. And though she cannot call out to him, she follows, her footsteps light, her breath caught somewhere between hope and dread. Let's pause for a moment to imagine this scene as the ancients might have seen it. The woods alive with summer air, the heat curling off the rocks, birds trilling sleepily in the canopy, and Echo, heartsick but voiceless, trailing a boy who has never loved anyone but his own solitude. She waits for him to speak. It's the only way she can speak back. This is the painful elegance of her curse. She needs him to begin the conversation. Eventually he does. "Is anyone here?" he calls, annoyed perhaps by the feeling of being watched. And she answers, "Here." He frowns. "Come to me." And she says, heart leaping, "To me." He spins around, confused and just a little alarmed. "Let's meet!" Echo, almost bursting with joy, repeats, "Let's meet!" And just like that, she steps from the trees. But Narcissus, alas, is not the poetic soul she hopes for. He recoils. His face, carved by gods but unmoved by kindness, twists in irritation. "Stay away," he says harshly. And Echo, still cursed, still hopeful, can only whisper, "Away." She flees. Now here's where myth and meaning start to blend. The ancient poets tell us Echo, humiliated and heartbroken, retreats into the cliffs, wasting away until only her voice remains. But others say she didn't disappear entirely. She simply became part of the land, diffused like mist, more present than ever. Her heartbreak echoes, literally, through the mountains, in every repeated word. Historians still argue whether the story of Echo and Narcissus is one tale or two sewn together. Some believe the myth of Echo's curse predates Narcissus entirely, and was tacked on later by clever poets to heighten the drama. Others argue the two were always meant to reflect, each the shadow of the other, one who can only repeat, one who can only admire himself. And that brings us to the pool, because Narcissus, after rejecting Echo and many others, finds himself alone. He leans over a spring, perhaps this very one, rippling now with your own reflection, and sees something miraculous. A face, and not just any face, the most beautiful face he's ever seen. He stares, enchanted. He smiles, it smiles. He whispers sweet nothings, and the lips echo them back. Sound familiar? He's been caught in his own kind of curse. Like Echo, he falls in love with a voice that only repeats, a presence that mirrors but never reaches back. The difference? Echo longed to connect. Narcissus longed only to admire. Depending on which version you follow, Narcissus eventually wastes away by that pool, either from starvation or heartbreak, never pulling himself away from his own reflection. In his place, a flower grows, a white and yellow bloom that we still call by his name. It's a beautifully ironic twist. A man in love with his own image becomes rooted to the earth, admired forever, and yet completely still, immobile, silent. And Echo? Still there, perhaps, watching, repeating, mourning. Now, here's where it gets juicy. The ancient Greeks loved symbolism, and this myth brims with it. Echo is the passive responder, unable to act. Narcissus is the active admirer, but unable to connect. Theirs is a tragic duet, sound and image, voice and face, locked in a loop. But the story doesn't end here. In later Roman retellings, particularly Ovid's lush and dreamy metamorphoses, the narrative becomes even more romanticized. Echo's love is portrayed as purer, more human. Narcissus becomes a warning, a lesson in vanity, selfishness, or the curse of being too perfect. Some modern scholars have read the myth as a metaphor for relationships where communication breaks down, where one partner is all talk, the other all reflection. Others interpret it through a psychological lens. Echo as the archetype of codependence, Narcissus as the self-absorbed narcissist. Yes, that word comes from him. No, he would not be flattered. And yet, through it all, it's hard not to feel sorry for them both. Echo, silenced and spurned. Narcissus, alone with his beauty, unable to look away. You kneel beside the spring, peering in. Your face looks back. Not enchanted, not cursed, but familiar. Behind you, if you listen closely, you can almost hear a sigh. Almost. You rise slowly from the side of the spring, brushing your hands along your tunic. Or, well, let's pretend you're wearing one of those flowing linen numbers the ancient Greeks favored. Loose, breezy, perfect for nighttime woodland wanderings. The moon has climbed higher now, sifting silver light over the canopy. You can still hear the faintest hint of echo in the trees, or maybe it's just the wind tracing over branches. The story of Echo and Narcissus might seem complete, self-contained like a little mythological snow globe. But if you've been paying attention, you know better. The ancient world didn't do standalone tales. They did sprawling, intertwining sagas, like vines climbing a marble statue. One myth grows into another. One character brushes against 100 others. And Echo? She wasn't done. After her heartbreak, Echo begins to appear on the edges of other myths, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a witness. She's always hovering, just behind the action. Not quite forgotten, not quite seen. If myths were theater, she'd be the stage whisperer, repeating the last lines as the lights dim. In some tellings, it's even said that Pan, the wild god of the wilderness and goat-related mischief, once tried to win Echo's affection. You know Pan. He's the sort of guy who shows up at forest parties uninvited, plays terrible music on a flute made from a tree nymph, and probably smells like damp moss and regret. Still, he's charming in that chaotic wood sprite kind of way. Pan didn't take rejection well. When Echo refused him, still aching, perhaps, from Narcissus, he grew jealous. In a mood we'll generously call emotionally volatile, he stirred a group of nearby shepherds into a frenzy. Ancient Greek myths do love their angry mobs, and in some of the darker versions, they tore Echo to pieces, though the earth gathered her voice and scattered it across the hills, keeping her alive in fragments. Now, you may be thinking, that's a lot, and it is. But myths weren't bedtime stories back then. They were explanations. Why do voices come back in the mountains? Echo. Why does sound feel different in caves? Echo. Why do we sometimes feel like someone's listening just beyond the trees? Echo. Interestingly, ancient travelers reported hearing strange acoustic effects in certain locations, temples, valleys, even empty amphitheaters. These natural phenomena, now explained by physics, were once thought to be Echo herself, playing tricks, listening in, or simply keeping company. In fact, some early mathematicians, like Pythagoras, yes, that Pythagoras of triangle fame, believed that echoing sounds followed a divine harmony. He and his followers saw music, math, and myth as part of the same universal fabric. And so when Echo replied, they believed she was not only speaking, but singing the music of the spheres. Historians still argue whether Echo was originally a deity in her own right, a sort of minor goddess of sound, or if she evolved into that role over time. Earlier Greek texts mention her as a kind of presence, not yet personalized. Later poets, like Ovid, gave her form, emotions, backstory. This might reflect a shift in cultural values, from collective experience to individual emotion. It's fascinating how often women in Greek mythology get transformed into trees, birds, stars, constellations, or in Echo's case, sound. There's a theme here. The female voice is powerful, poetic, and in so many stories, it gets silenced, altered, or spread thin across nature. But while many of these tales feel like endings, Echo's is different. Her transformation is not total erasure. Her voice remains, still heard, still active. That makes her unusual, even a little rebellious. Where other nymphs vanish into reeds or become clouds, Echo persists. Even now, her name shows up in unexpected places. Take the Roman writer Vitruvius, who designed early amphitheaters. He described how architects should build with Echo in mind, using curves and corners to catch her voice and bounce it back to the audience. They weren't just building structures, they were designing with a myth in the blueprint. Later, in medieval monasteries, monks wrote marginal notes about Echo. Some believed she was a symbol of memory. Others thought she was a temptation, an invisible mocker of human pride. Still others suspected she was a saint who never quite got canonized. And then there's the Renaissance painters, who sometimes tucked her into their landscapes. A pale figure half glimpsed in the trees, leaning close to a stream. Most viewers missed her entirely, but the hint was there, always watching, always repeating. It's no coincidence that Echo's myth survived the centuries better than most. Because unlike fire-breathing chimeras or multi-headed hydras, echoes are real. You've heard one. Maybe today. Maybe when you called out in an empty stairwell or across a canyon. Maybe even just humming to yourself in a tiled bathroom. That's the magic. Echo isn't just myth. She's a sensory experience. You feel her in your bones. And unlike Narcissus, whose reflection fades, Echo endures because of you. Without someone to speak, she cannot repeat. You're part of her story now. A strange thought, maybe, or a comforting one. You step further into the woods, where the trees grow closer together and the air takes on that dreamlike hush. You whisper something. Doesn't matter what. And back it comes. Comes. You leave the clearing behind, following the narrow path deeper into the forest. The trees sway gently above you, their branches whispering secrets from centuries past. It's darker here, not frightening, just cozy in that deeply ancient way, as if the forest remembers every footstep, every sigh, every lost traveler who once passed through under the same moonlight. Speaking of footsteps, yours are now mingling with a much older trail, one trodden not just by Echo and Narcissus, but by generations of storytellers, pilgrims, and wanderers who carried their myths from mountain to mountain. You step carefully over a root, duck beneath a mossy branch, and pause as a cool breeze brushes your face like a quiet exhale. We're heading now into the part of the myth that's often forgotten, because after Echo fades into sound, and Narcissus into flower, the land itself becomes sacred. The spring where he once gazed becomes a destination. Pilgrims make offerings, poets come to muse, tourists eventually bring picnic baskets. You might be surprised to learn that ancient people didn't just tell stories, they mapped them. They turned myth into geography. It's why you can still find Echo's Cave in various parts of Greece, or Narcissus Pool nestled somewhere in Boeotia. Each one insists it's the original. Historians still argue whether any of them match the original descriptions, or whether these sacred sites were simply good at self-promotion. You know the type. First-century influencers with togas and scrolls. Come bathe where Narcissus once sighed. That sort of thing. But let's imagine one of those early pilgrims. You, perhaps, wrapped in a wool cloak, feet sore from days of walking. You arrive at a quiet glade where the water is still, and someone tells you, "This is the place." You kneel, touch the water. You whisper a prayer, not for beauty perhaps, but for clarity, for understanding. And the spring answers you, softly. Softly. What a curious thing, to turn a myth into a physical destination. But that's exactly what ancient cultures did. They wove stories into the land, and then walked back into them. It was their version of immersive storytelling, far more hands-on than a book or scroll. One of the most curious details from later sources is that pilgrims would leave small tokens at these sites. Coins, bits of carved stone, and, yes, sometimes even little mirrors. Can you imagine that? Offering a mirror to the spirit of Narcissus? A strange kind of tribute, a dangerous one if he's still gazing. And as for Echo, some left song lyrics scratched onto bark. Others just spoke aloud, hoping to be heard. It's not hard to imagine a lonely traveler hearing their own words float back and wondering, is she still listening? By the time of the Roman Empire, the myth had become wildly popular. Ovid's Metamorphoses cemented it in poetic amber, and artists of all kinds drew from its tragic beauty. Painters imagined Echo as a pale, haunted figure, half consumed by leaves. Sculptors captured Narcissus frozen mid-stare, fingers just grazing the water. The Romans, never subtle, sometimes used the story as a cautionary tale in their moral teachings. "Don't be vain," they'd say. "Don't fall in love with your own reflection." It was the ancient version of those middle school assemblies with overly enthusiastic speakers holding up mirrors and warning about self-esteem. Still, there's something irresistible about the image. The lonely nymph, unable to speak her own thoughts. The boy who sees only himself. The silence between them filled with echoes and ripples. Some versions of the tale add even more layers. In one, Narcissus has a twin sister who dies young, and his mourning turns inward. He gazes into the pool not because he's in love with himself, but because he sees her in his reflection. Others hint that Narcissus rejects love not out of cruelty, but out of a sacred vow to remain chaste. Each version tweaks the emotional tone. Tragic, romantic, spiritual, or simply strange. And yet through all of these interpretations, Echo lingers. There's even a curious medieval manuscript that speculates she became a kind of nature spirit. Not entirely gone, just evolved. This version paints her as a gentle guide for lost travelers, especially those who whisper kind things to the forest. Say something cruel, and the echo disappears. Say something kind, and it comes back. Maybe even a little warmer. It's an oddly comforting thought. A spirit who only responds to gentleness, who lives in sound, but listens for sincerity. So as you walk, you try it. A whisper. "I'm here. I'm here." There it is again. Of course, in modern times, Echo's name has been borrowed by everything from tech gadgets to pop songs. It's ironic, really. A name that once symbolized voicelessness, now used to give voice to machines. Somewhere, a poet is sighing, but her story persists. Not in the bold headlines of Zeus or Achilles, but in the soft margins of myth. She's never the center, never the victor, never the hero, and yet she remains. As for Narcissus, his flower still grows. Scientists, perhaps unwittingly poetic, call its genus Narcissus poeticus. It blooms near springs, thrives in quiet soil, and sometimes droops as if gazing downward. A coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the myth lingers there, in root and petal. You follow the path as it bends along a shallow ravine. Ahead, you hear water trickling. Maybe another spring. You wonder what would happen if you looked in. What would you see? Don't worry. This story isn't about you becoming the next Narcissus. Probably. You don't look into the water. Not yet. Instead, you walk alongside it, letting your fingers brush the cool ferns that fringe its edge. They curl slightly at your touch, as if recognizing a fellow traveler. The stream babbles gently, spilling secrets in a language only half remembered. This forest is older than memory, older than myths. But if you listen closely, you can still hear them. Echo's soft repetitions, Narcissus's sighs, the crackle of ancient storytellers warming their hands by the fire, preparing to tell this tale once again. Because this myth, like so many others, didn't remain frozen in time. It traveled, it changed. And as it did, it gathered meaning like moss on a stone. Tonight, let's follow the path the myth took, out of the Greek hills and into the libraries and salons of Rome. Roman poets adored Greek mythology, but they rarely left things untouched. Ovid, especially, had a knack for reshaping stories with a twist of irony or a pinch of drama. In Metamorphoses, he gives us the version of Echo and Narcissus that most people know today. Tragic, elegant, a little bit cheeky. You remember how it went? Echo loses her voice, falls for Narcissus, gets rejected, wastes away, becomes a voice. Narcissus, in turn, is punished for his vanity by the gods. He falls in love with his own reflection, and, unable to possess it, withers beside the spring until a flower grows in his place. Ovid was writing during the reign of Augustus, a time when Rome was polishing its image with golden laurels and moral lessons, so the tale becomes both entertainment and warning. Don't be too proud. Don't ignore love. Don't stare too long in the mirror, unless you're okay with becoming botanical. But it wasn't all somber moralizing. Ovid had a flair for mischief, and you can feel it in the way he describes Echo, darting behind trees, stealing glances, mimicking words. There's a subtle humor there, a warmth that suggests he sympathized with her. You almost imagine him chuckling to himself as he wrote, "She could only return what was last spoken." Spoken, see? Still with us. Of course, ancient readers took different lessons from the story. Stoics saw in Narcissus the folly of attachment, loving something illusory, impermanent, and therefore doomed. Early Christians, reading the myth centuries later, interpreted Echo as the soul calling out to a self-obsessed world. Others just liked the drama and used the story as courtly entertainment. But not everyone agreed on the details. Some versions, possibly even older than Ovid's, suggest Narcissus wasn't punished by the gods at all. Instead, his reflection was a kind of divine gift, one final fleeting moment of clarity before death. Historians still argue whether this reading casts him as victim or visionary. Was he cursed, or did he glimpse something deeper? And what of Echo? In certain obscure fragments, snippets found on pottery shards or bits of faded papyrus, Echo isn't simply a rejected lover. She's a guardian of sacred springs, a nymph whose job was to protect the stillness of water and the secrets it held. To her, Narcissus was an intruder, a noisy one. Imagine that version for a moment. Echo, annoyed that some boy won't stop talking to his own face, decides to repeat his words back at him until he gets spooked and runs away. That's not heartbreak, it's high-level trolling. And honestly, relatable. There's a fringe theory, popular among a few eccentric scholars, that Echo represents an early personification of acoustic memory. That is, before writing, before books, people depended on memory and repetition to preserve their knowledge. Echo, then, becomes a metaphor for that process. A voice that remembers, even when the body is gone. It's a beautiful idea, that even if we vanish, something of us remains in the sound we leave behind. Now, as you walk along the water, the forest starts to thin slightly. The trees grow farther apart, and patches of moonlight paint your path with pale silver. The breeze carries faint night-bird songs and the distant rustle of something small, perhaps a fox, perhaps just your imagination. You pause beside a smooth rock near the edge of the stream. It's rounded, polished by centuries of water and feet. A perfect spot to sit and think. You lower yourself slowly, letting the stillness settle over you. Just across the stream is a small stone basin, half hidden under vines. It looks like it might have once been an offering site, a place where someone, maybe a long-ago poet, maybe a bored shepherd, placed a token in memory of a myth. Maybe a coin, maybe a carved name, maybe just a whispered word. It's humbling, isn't it? How something as simple as a story can echo across time. Not just in books or lectures, but in little rituals. In a girl humming to herself on a walk. In someone calling their dog in a canyon. In you, right now, walking through a place that doesn't exist, but feels like it does. And even now, Echo's influence shows up in places you might not expect. In psychology, for instance, the term echoism describes a personality style that avoids attention, avoids imposing, and mirrors others' needs before their own. It's been contrasted with narcissism, of course, which has become practically synonymous with vanity and self-obsession. But these modern terms flatten the original myths into clinical diagnoses. They miss the nuance, the longing, the beauty. Echo wasn't just passive. She wasn't just tragic. She loved, she mourned, and she adapted. She became part of the landscape, not out of defeat, but out of persistence. And Narcissus, well, yes, he was obsessed with his reflection. But he was also alone. Cursed, yes, but perhaps also misunderstood. A boy taught not to love anything but himself, and even that, not safely. You lean forward slightly, watching the water ripple. Your own reflection appears there, soft, moonlit, just the suggestion of your face. You smile, or try to. It's a little strange to look too long, but don't worry. You're not about to fall in love with your own image and forget the world. You're just resting here, letting the story unfold. Echo is nearby, she always is. The stream meanders on, content to take its time. You follow it at a gentle pace, toes brushing moss and the occasional stray root, as if the earth itself wants to remind you not to rush. This path, much like the myth itself, winds rather than charges forward. Now that the Roman poets have had their say, it's time to step beyond the Mediterranean. Yes, myths have a passport, and this one got stamped repeatedly as it traveled. Over the centuries, the tale of Echo and Narcissus slipped quietly into new languages, new manuscripts, and eventually new art forms, each retelling reshaping it like river stones in the current. You don't have to squint too hard to see that the Middle Ages had a bit of a thing for mirrors and flowers and moralizing stories. This myth fit right in. By the time we reach the early medieval period, let's say around the 8th to 12th centuries, Greek and Roman texts are being copied and preserved in monasteries. Latin is still the intellectual lingua franca, but it's not just a case of dusty monks hunched over scrolls. These stories got interpreted through a Christian lens too, whether subtly or with an enthusiastic theological twist. Take the Narcissus story, for example. In many medieval retellings, the tale becomes a moral fable, something like vanity leads to doom, which, to be fair, was also a favorite sermon topic for about 600 years. Instead of a tragic poetic figure, Narcissus becomes a cautionary example, a beautiful boy undone by the sin of pride. Think less tortured soul, more pre-Renaissance Instagram warning label. Echo's role? Well, she shifts depending on the author. In some retellings, she remains the mournful, tragic nymph. In others, she's barely mentioned, an echo of herself, if you will. Still others portray her as the voice of temptation, calling Narcissus away from his righteous path. Historians still argue whether medieval writers truly misunderstood the original myth or simply adapted it for didactic purposes. After all, adapting pagan stories for Christian audiences was a bit like medieval fanfic. Same characters, new morals. In the hands of the 12th century writer Alain de Lille, for instance, the Narcissus story becomes a metaphysical allegory. Narcissus represents the soul, the pool is the world, and Echo. She's something like the lingering voice of carnal temptation. It's not exactly the kind of bedtime tale you'd tell children, but then again, medieval bedtime stories were often one goose chase away from terrifying. Still, these adaptations were not without beauty. Medieval illustrators, especially those working on illuminated manuscripts, adored the visual elements of the myth. They painted Narcissus gazing longingly into ornate pools, surrounded by gold leaf vines and blue lacquered skies. Echo is sometimes shown peeking from behind trees, always watching, never speaking. You imagine one of these illustrators, perhaps a young apprentice, working by candlelight, dabbing tiny droplets of silver onto the surface of the water in the image, thinking, he really should just look away. But of course, Narcissus never does. And then, surprisingly, the story began to shift again. This time through medieval love poetry. Enter the courtly lovers, troubadours, minnesingers, poets who spent their days pining for unattainable ladies and their nights composing songs about how impossible it all was. For these romantics, the story of Narcissus wasn't a lesson. It was a mood. Echo's hopeless yearning, relatable. Narcissus's fixation, also, unfortunately, relatable. Being misunderstood, longing for someone who doesn't reciprocate. These weren't vices, they were vibes. In the famed Roman de la Rose, a sprawling 13th century allegorical poem, Narcissus appears as a warning to young lovers. But he's not just scorned, he's also pitied. His beauty is a curse, his fate unavoidable. Echo is, once again, a background figure. Still, her sorrow adds texture. And her silence? It lingers, even on the pages she's not mentioned. By now, you're walking through a thinner stretch of forest, where small stone shrines occasionally peek out from under moss and ivy. Some of them seem to have basins or carvings that might have once depicted lovers, gods, or both. It's hard to say for sure. The years have softened the details. You pause beside one that's especially weather-worn. A basin filled with rainwater reflects the star-dotted sky. For a moment, you imagine a medieval pilgrim doing exactly this, stopping here on a quiet walk through unfamiliar woods, gazing into the water and thinking of stories told by candlelight in distant monasteries. And perhaps they thought of echo, of the idea that a voice could linger, even without a body, that longing could live in the air long after the person was gone. There's something medieval about that thought, about the endurance of sorrow, about giving beauty to sadness and meaning to waiting. There's also something very human about it. You keep walking. In some later versions of the story, circulating in folklore rather than formal manuscripts, Echo is given more agency. She's not just doomed to repeat, she chooses her words. She becomes selective. Some oral traditions even suggest that she learned to manipulate the repetition, changing emphasis, altering tone, becoming a kind of woodland trickster. A living echo, yes, but a clever one. These versions never made it into the big manuscripts. They were told on cold nights, in shepherd huts and quiet villages, passed along by storytellers who valued a little mischief with their melancholy. It's here that the line between myth and folktale blurs. Is Echo a goddess? A ghost? A metaphor? Or just the sound of laughter bouncing off stone walls in a valley? You glance behind you. The trees sway gently, as if to say, all of the above. And as for Narcissus, his fate remained fixed, but not forgotten. Across medieval Europe, his story was embroidered into tapestries, scribbled into love poems, whispered in gardens and courtyards. Always gazing, always yearning. The myth persisted because people recognized themselves in it. You too have loved something unreachable. You too have felt like a voice with no reply. But you are not alone here. The forest continues to murmur. The water flows. Echo listens. You walk onward, barely aware that your steps now follow the slow rhythm of the trees around you, as if their roots are tapping out a lullaby just beneath the soil. The moss has grown thicker here, softer than a carpet, and the air holds that delicious hush, the kind that settles over libraries or old cathedrals. Time stretches, and your thoughts trail along with it. Speaking of stretching time, the myth of Echo and Narcissus didn't freeze in the medieval era. It quietly slipped into the Renaissance like a stowaway hiding under a painter's smock. Suddenly, with the revival of classical learning, everyone was dusting off the old scrolls and squinting at Latin with a mixture of awe and artistic ambition. Ancient myths weren't just stories now. They were source material, and this was the golden age of allegory. Every object in a painting had to mean something. A lute could be harmony, a candle, probably the brevity of life. A kid gazing into a pond? Vanity, obviously. Artists, writers, even philosophers. Everyone was remixing the Greeks like they'd just discovered them on vinyl. Narcissus, that poor beautiful boy, had a full Renaissance glow-up. Take Caravaggio, for instance. He painted Narcissus leaning over a pool, the lighting sharp enough to shave with. The background? Pitch black. The reflection? Haunting. There's a sort of tragic intimacy to it. No flowers, no distractions, just a young man lost in himself. You can practically hear the silence in the room. But here's the twist. Caravaggio wasn't just painting a myth. He was also saying something about self-obsession, about the line between reality and illusion, about that very Renaissance concept of individualism. A fancy way of saying people were starting to take long, meaningful looks in mirrors. Echo, however, didn't fare as well in visual art. While Narcissus kept getting screen time, in sculptures, engravings, and oil paintings, Echo was often left out, relegated to titles or poetic footnotes. Some artists included her as a shadowy figure in the woods, watching but not interfering, but even that was rare. It's like someone in the 1500s decided she wasn't marketable. But literature treated her a bit more kindly. During the Renaissance, poets and playwrights were busy unpacking Echo's character. They imagined her with richer inner worlds, her voice as something more than a tool. Some writers even gave her the ability to influence, to reflect emotion, not just language. Historians still argue whether this literary recentering of Echo was a proto-feminist moment, or just a quirk of the times. Either way, she was inching out of the shadows. Slowly, carefully, quietly, of course. You brush aside a fern and find yourself at the edge of a still pond. It's small, almost hidden, as if embarrassed to be caught mirroring the legends. But the water is clear, and moonlight rests gently on its surface. You glance down, just a quick look. There you are. Or rather, the quieter version of you. A reflection softened by ripples and the distance of centuries. You imagine Narcissus seeing himself here. Would it feel different? Less glamorous, more peaceful? The Renaissance was also a time of revived stagecraft. And what is Echo, if not a creature of sound? In certain pastoral plays, Echo would be voiced off-stage, calling back a character's last words with a dry wit or a mournful sigh. Sometimes she served as comic relief. Other times, she was the ghost of the forest, a reminder that nature hears everything, even when it doesn't answer. In Ben Jonson's The Forest, a poem literally titled Epode, Echo appears as a voice lamenting the cruelty of love. It's not subtle, but it doesn't have to be. Love, especially unreturned love, isn't exactly a subtle experience. And then, slowly, Echo's myth took root in philosophy. Yes, really. As Renaissance thinkers puzzled over the nature of perception, they began to reference Echo and Narcissus in their musings. Narcissus was the symbol of the self becoming obsessed with its own image, a metaphor that, if you squint, actually sounds suspiciously modern. Echo, on the other hand, was seen as an emblem of memory, of resonance, of passive reception. One French thinker even described Echo as the soul's mimic, forever reflecting, but never creating. That's a bit bleak, you think, stepping over a root. But maybe it was just his way of saying that Echo represents something we all experience. The repetition of what's been said, what's been done, what's been lost. She is grief given rhythm, memory with reverb. Still, this was the age when voice and selfhood were beginning to intertwine. The printing press had arrived. Books were spreading faster than gossip at a banquet, and suddenly everyone wanted their words to last. Poor Echo. She didn't get to publish, but she did get to linger, even into the 17th century, when Baroque dramatists were churning out theatrical allegories like there was no tomorrow. Echo remained a useful tool, a way to fill the space with something both literal and symbolic. You find yourself humming, just a little tune. The woods answer. Not in song, of course, but in rustles, in breezes, in the way sound seems to double back on itself. Somewhere, something creaks. Echo? Wind? It's hard to say. The pond is behind you now, but the image stays with you. The moon, the silence, the reflection that looked not quite like you, but not quite unlike you either. It's that Renaissance balance, self-awareness just shy of self-absorption, which brings us to one last note, a particularly strange fringe tidbit from this period. A group of scholars in the late Renaissance claimed that certain caves could record sounds, much like Echo herself. If you sang into the right rocky chamber, they said, the stones would retain your voice, only to release it days or even weeks later. Historians still argue whether this was wild imagination or an early poetic take on acoustics. But wouldn't it be something to speak once and have your voice remembered long after you're gone? Perhaps Echo's still speaking, just very, very softly. You continue walking. The forest ahead shimmers, and the path curves gently, like a question not yet answered. You wander forward, not quite sure whether the path is leading you or you're leading it. The stones beneath your feet feel rounder now, worn smooth by the passage of centuries, or maybe just by all the other pilgrims in your dreams. The trees seem less dense, the stars overhead a bit bolder, poking through the velvet sky like gossiping candles at a medieval tavern. And speaking of gossip, let's turn to the towns. You see, as you make your way through the countryside, you begin to notice something curious about these little medieval towns dotted along the pilgrim routes. They're not just sleepy villages with chickens clucking in corners and mysterious herbs drying in windows. No, they're also carefully curated hotspots of what can only be described as medieval tourism. Imagine it. Dusty pilgrims arriving with sore feet, jangling coin purses, and a desperate craving for holy relics, hearty stew, and maybe a bit of dramatic storytelling. The towns, ever enterprising, provided all three. And one of the most booming trades in these stopover towns? You guessed it, the production and sale of pilgrim badges. Now, let's be clear. These weren't just quick souvenirs to slap onto your medieval man purse and forget about. No, pilgrim badges were serious business. There were entire craft economies built around designing, casting, and selling them. From London to Santiago to Canterbury, these towns became small badge empires, with workshops clinking and clanking away behind every creaky timber door. Historians still argue whether these badge-making hubs operated more like artisanal guilds or medieval sweatshops. Either way, they were astonishingly prolific. A single workshop might produce thousands of badges per year, pouring molten lead-tin alloy into intricate molds. Once cooled, the badges were snipped, polished, and often pierced so they could be sewn onto hats, cloaks, or bags. You could hear a seasoned pilgrim coming from a mile away, his jacket tinkling like a holy wind chime. The designs themselves? Little marvels of micro-storytelling. You might see the scallop shell of St. James of Compostela, a tiny bust of St. Thomas Becket, or even the amusingly detailed bottle badge from the shrine of Our Lady of Rocamadour, shaped like a teeny-tiny holy water flask. One particularly famous badge from Canterbury depicted Becket's head in a jar, which, if nothing else, is certainly memorable. But here's a slightly more obscure tidbit. One design trend that cropped up in several towns was the inclusion of secular or even cheeky motifs alongside the sacred ones. A badge shaped like a comb? That might represent Mary Magdalene. A pair of clasped hands? Likely a token of reconciliation, or perhaps something more romantic if the glances exchanged across the chapel were any indication. And let's not forget the vendors themselves. You're walking past a stone well now, mossy, deep, full of echoes, and it wouldn't be surprising if, just beside it, a sprightly badge seller from the 13th century had set up shop with a painted sign and an aggressively persuasive tone. They weren't monks or priests, most of them. They were laypeople, entrepreneurs who knew a captive market when they saw one. Their pitches might sound something like this. A fine badge for your lady, sir, from the very shrine where miracles are born. Or, only 2 deniers for the last of our St. Denis badges, blessed by association, or your money not returned. It's hard to resist that kind of marketing. Now, while these badges were technically religious in nature, let's not pretend everyone wore them out of pure spiritual fervor. Sure, some pilgrims clutched them as proof of devotion. Others, though, saw them as social currency. Wearing the right combination of badges could indicate not just where you'd been, but what kind of person you were. Devout, yes, but also well-traveled. Pious, yes, but also fashionably in the know. It was the medieval equivalent of having airport lounge tags on your carry-on bag. The more unique your badge collection, the more impressive your reputation back home. And if you think that's a stretch, consider this. People in towns far from pilgrimage centers would buy these badges from returning travelers or itinerant peddlers, just to wear them to mass or market and bask in borrowed holiness. Imagine standing in the village square, your hat bristling with tiny pewter saints, casually dropping the line. Oh yes, picked this one up just outside Cologne. Divine soup, by the way. The badge economy thrived not just because of pilgrims, but because everyone wanted a little piece of that sacred sparkle. A few cities even developed their own unofficial badges, despite lacking any major shrines. These often played with local legends or saints-in-waiting, kind of like indie badge markets, if you will. And pilgrims, ever hungry for talismans and stories, would snatch them up, no questions asked. Now you're passing what looks like a crumbling stone archway. Maybe it was once the entrance to a town square, or a gate marking the start of the market. You pause, imagining stalls lined up beneath it. Spices, candles, flasks, and yes, all those glorious badges catching the light, glinting like pewter constellations. You lean on the stones for a moment. They're cool to the touch, still whispering the bustle of those long-gone markets. You hear laughter, somewhere in your imagination, and the jangle of coins being handed over for a tiny, shining token. There was even a mild black market in forged badges, people casting their own unauthorized designs, or counterfeiting popular styles from more prestigious towns. If that sounds weirdly modern, well, it kind of was. Wherever there's demand, there's a knockoff. One 14th century cleric grumbled that badge sellers were worse than jongleurs and accused them of turning religion into theater. And to be fair, there was a lot of theater, but also a lot of joy. Pilgrimage was hard, dangerous work. A little lightness, a little pewter sparkle on your shoulder wasn't the worst thing. And despite all the debate, the church never quite shut down the badge trade. In fact, many shrines regulated and taxed it. Some even offered official versions, stamped with the approval of a bishop or monastery. You know, just in case medieval pilgrims were feeling picky about brand authenticity. You take a deep breath. The night air smells faintly of smoke now. Maybe someone up ahead is lighting a fire, boiling a pot of something garlicky and wonderful. The forest thins a bit more, and the stars widen above you like eyes. Just over the next ridge, there might be a town waiting. And if you're lucky, someone selling a badge shaped like a fish, or a finger bone, or a miniature donkey with wings. Because why not? Your feet crunch lightly over gravel now. The sound barely loud enough to startle a rabbit. The sky above has settled into that inky shade of night that feels more like velvet than color. And you're certain you just heard a distant lute. Could be your imagination. Or it could be the ghost of a tavern minstrel, still playing to pilgrims who've long since gone to bed. And speaking of ghosts, let's talk about the people who weren't exactly living when they joined the pilgrimage routes. Saints, or more specifically, their body parts. You see, The medieval obsession with saints was not limited to the heavenly idea of their virtue or good deeds. No, medieval Christians wanted physical proof. A splinter of a femur, a single rib, a tooth, preferably one that had cured someone's gout or glowed faintly in candlelight. And pilgrim badges often featured these relics, sometimes in abstract designs, sometimes in frankly hilarious levels of anatomical detail. These relic badges were not just tokens, they were miniatures, tributes to the holy remains enshrined in a given town or cathedral. Take the famous badge from Cologne, shaped like a reliquary bust, a tiny, head-shaped badge honoring the heads of the Magi themselves, said to reside in the city's massive cathedral. The badge looked a bit like a helmet with eyes, but that didn't stop thousands from proudly pinning it to their cloaks. Now imagine you arriving in such a place. You shuffle past market stalls and incense vendors, and there, inside the cathedral, behind gilded bars and swinging lanterns, lies a saint's tibia in a crystal tube. The room is silent, save for the creak of floorboards and the collective awe of a few dozen cloaked figures. You lean in, staring at a bone that hasn't seen sunlight in 1,000 years. Then, you buy a badge in its image and tuck it into your sleeve like a secret. Quirky fact: some relic badges were designed to mimic the containers rather than the bones. Shrines loved to put saints' remains in dramatic shapes. Bejeweled hands, feet, even entire arms. So badge makers followed suit. Want to show your neighbors that you stood before the holy shin of St. Quentin? There's a badge for that. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Not all relics were entirely verified. Historians still argue whether medieval shrines genuinely believed in the authenticity of every splinter of the true cross, or whether they quietly understood they were dealing in what you might call symbolic duplicates. A bit of wood from an old Galilean olive tree? Close enough. A monk's tooth passed off as a bishop's? Well, the faithful will never know. And anyway, does it really matter if miracles still happen? Pilgrims, however, weren't always picky. What mattered was touching the relic, or at least getting close to it. And the badge, that little souvenir, was a way of carrying that contact home. Like scooping up a handful of holy air and pressing it into metal. Let's not overlook the stranger relics, though. One obscure shrine in Normandy claimed to have a piece of the Virgin Mary's veil. Another boasted a vial of Christ's tears. A monastery in Fécamp insisted it possessed, wait for it, Jesus' navel. That last one is either deeply touching or deeply odd, depending on how much sleep you've had. And naturally, where there were relics, there were copycats. Enter the rogue relic badge peddlers. These folks operated outside the church's blessing, selling badges from imaginary shrines, or misrepresenting where a relic was actually housed. One cheeky fellow was caught peddling authentic badges from a saint, who, as it turned out, had never existed. Authorities confiscated his wares and banned him from 3 dioceses. Legend says he went on to sell novelty belt buckles in Toulouse. Badges also served a pseudo-magical function. People believed the relics they depicted could protect them, not just spiritually but physically. Wear the badge of a saint known for healing headaches, fewer migraines. A badge featuring a holy tooth, protection from toothache. It was kind of like medieval health insurance, except shinier and more likely to melt in a fire. There's something charming about the sheer hopefulness of it all. You can picture yourself in a candle-lit room, pinning a badge above your bed, whispering a prayer, and trusting that a 6-centimeter pewter foot would keep your livestock from falling ill. And to make it all more accessible, some shrines had pilgrim kits, a bundle that might include a small ampulla of holy water, a badge, and a printed prayer scroll. These little devotional packages were incredibly popular, and as you drift further into the medieval towns of your dreams, you can almost imagine reaching into your bag and finding one tucked neatly between your spare wool socks and that chunk of hard cheese you've been slowly nibbling for 3 days. You pass a shadowy figure on the road. Another pilgrim, you think. But they don't speak, and their face stays hidden beneath a deep hood. You nod all the same. Maybe they've just come from a relic viewing themselves. Maybe they're contemplating the holy pinky toe of Saint Apollonia, patron saint of dentistry, and somewhere in your satchel, nestled between a damp cloth and a string of prayer beads, there's a little badge you picked up back in town. It's shaped like a jar. No inscription, just the faint impression of a lid and some ornate swirls. You smile. You're not even sure what it contains or if it contains anything, but you believe in its story. Because that's what these relic badges really are. Pocket-sized stories. Small promises that your journey meant something, even if the details get fuzzy. Even if you forget the saint's name, or the church's spire, or the exact miracle attributed to a shin bone in a golden box. And as the road continues to wind and narrow, you finger the edges of your badge. It's rough, but comforting. Like the memory of a place you only half remember, or the feeling of waking from a dream you hope will last a little longer. The morning fog clings to the hills like an old wool cloak. It's damp, clumsy, and refuses to let go. Your boots, already well acquainted with the dirt paths of this long journey, are now smeared with dew-heavy mud. The birds are just beginning their squabbles overhead, mostly about worms and territorial pine cones, one assumes, and you yawn, stretch, and press on. Today's path leads towards something a little more theatrical. Let's talk about Miracle Place. Yes, that's right. Holy entertainment. Because medieval pilgrimages weren't all prayers and blisters. Sometimes they came with a bit of flair. Now picture this. You've arrived at a bustling village after 4 days of walking with a man who insists on reciting the Book of Psalms from memory, whether you asked for it or not. You're tired. You're hungry. You've narrowly avoided stepping in something unspeakable that came out of a donkey. And then, boom, a stage. Well, a makeshift wooden platform, really. 2 carts shoved together and draped in faded linens. But it's a stage nonetheless. The crowd has already gathered. Someone's shouting about a saint's lost sandal. A small child is pretending to faint for extra alms. And before you can blink, the miracle play begins. A miracle play, for those unfamiliar with the term, is a dramatization of a saint's life, a Bible story, or a cautionary tale involving demons with papier-mâché horns and highly questionable moral decisions. Some of these were written with genuine reverence. Others, well, let's just say the line between devotion and community improv was often very, very thin. You nudge your way to the front as an actor in a ragged tunic bellows about divine vengeance. Another in painted angel wings trips over his robe, nearly face-planting into the saintly prop coffin. The audience cackles, and a boy selling roasted onions whispers that this is the 3rd time the angel has fallen this week. Still, you can't help but be drawn in. These plays served a vital purpose. They reminded pilgrims, most of whom couldn't read, of the stories behind the relics they had come to venerate. Didn't know who St. Cuthbert was? Watch the play. Confused about how St. Margaret escaped the belly of a dragon? Spoiler alert, she did it with divine help and probably a great deal of fake smoke on stage. Historians still argue whether the plays were church-sponsored sermons disguised as entertainment or entertainment trying to sneak into church territory under the guise of morality. Either way, people loved them. Quirky fact of the day. Some towns had miracle play guilds, whose sole job was to perform these stories for religious festivals and visiting pilgrims. The best actors gained local fame, and not a few were reportedly bribed with meat pies and very strong ale to appear in rival villages. And miracle plays weren't quiet affairs. Trumpets blared, drums thudded, lines were shouted, not spoken, with all the subtlety of a goose being chased by a cart. For a pilgrim who had spent weeks in silence or murmured prayer, it was a sensory explosion. Somewhere between sacred and circus, you're nudged again. This time by a woman balancing what looks like a turnip pastry in one hand and her toddler in the other. She winks, says the next scene's her favorite. You glance at the stage just in time to see a man in a devil costume emerge from behind a barrel, wielding a wooden pitchfork and laughing maniacally. The crowd erupts. The toddler shrieks with joy. You try not to laugh, but fail miserably. In a moment of calm between scenes, you overhear a debate behind you. Two older men arguing over whether the devil's accent is supposed to be regional or if it's just Brother Thomas putting on a silly voice again. The discussion ends with one of them being handed a hunk of bread as a peace offering. And the play continues. You realize the badge you picked up earlier, shaped like a saint rising from a coffin, is likely inspired by one of these dramas. The badge's saint wears a tiny crown and holds a scroll. Now that you've seen it performed, the image makes more sense. It's a souvenir not just of the relic, but of the whole performance, the story, the memory. Some towns sold special badges just for miracle play festivals, limited editions, if you will. Pilgrims wore them proudly, especially if they had been in the splash zone of a play involving holy water. Of course, there were critics. A few fussy bishops complained that the plays became too bawdy, too comedic, that the devil shouldn't fall into a sheep trough, no matter how funny it looked, that angels should not make fart jokes. One particularly grumpy monk wrote a letter describing a play where St. Peter had to stop mid-monologue to swat at a drunk audience member's hat. Still, for most pilgrims, these moments made the journey. They were funny, vivid, grounding. A reminder that even saints had stories, struggles, and occasionally, slapstick. As the final act ends and the crowd erupts into applause, you find yourself clapping too, badge jingling gently on your tunic. You catch the eye of the actor playing the devil. He grins. You swear he gives you a cheeky little bow. You wander away from the makeshift stage, past the food stalls and noisy children, down toward the winding road again. Your steps are lighter, your spirit oddly lifted. Not from a miracle, perhaps, but from the shared joy of a story well told. And in your bag, nestled between the crust of a half-eaten onion tart and a crumpled map drawn by a very confused monk, your badge glows faintly in the fading sun. You touch it, smile, and walk on. You leave the village behind, just as twilight begins to sip gently from the horizon, turning the sky a dusky plum. The smell of roasted onions lingers in your cloak, and there's a faint ringing in your ears from a child enthusiastically banging a cooking pot behind you for the final scene's heavenly thunder. But as the path winds back into the open fields, the silence returns like an old friend. Now, the quiet gives you space to think about the stories you've heard today. The saints, the devils, the tumbling angels. But more than that, you start wondering, who decided these stories were badge-worthy in the first place? Who made that little metal token you're now thumbing in your pocket? Welcome to the world of medieval badge-making. Imagine a workshop. Small, cluttered, lit by the pale flicker of an oil lamp. There's a craftsman hunched over a wooden bench, brow furrowed, tongue peeking out slightly in deep concentration as he presses a thin sheet of lead alloy into a carved mold. No modern machinery here. No laser cutters, no factory belts. Just hand, eye, and a tiny spoon-like tool used to nudge stubborn details into place. The result? A pilgrim badge. Maybe it's shaped like a saint holding a chicken. Maybe it's a tiny fish. Yes, there were fish-shaped badges, especially from sites near water miracles. Or perhaps it's a grinning face of a local hermit who supposedly healed people with dandelion tea. These artisans weren't just smiths. They were storytellers too in their own way. Each badge was a distillation of a legend, a moment, a place. Wear it, and you carried the story. Drop it in a river, and the water remembered the miracle. Lose it, and perhaps some plowman 100 years later would find it lodged in a field, blinking back at him with a tiny, beatific smile. Mainstream fact time. Badge production really took off in the 13th and 14th centuries, especially in pilgrimage hotspots like Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, and Walsingham. Some sites were so badge-heavy, travelers said you could hear pilgrims coming by the metallic jingle of their cloaks. They called it the Tin Symphony. It was either inspiring or deeply annoying, depending on how many miles you'd walked that day. But it wasn't just the spiritual badge makers cornering the market. Enter the bootleggers. Yes, pirated badges were absolutely a thing. Historians still argue whether these were cheeky imitations made for profit, or if they were quietly accepted as part of the system. After all, why pay full price for a badge of St. Sebastian when Brother Harold's cousin could make you one just as shiny for half the cost and a wink? Sometimes these fakes were obvious. Poor detail, misspelled inscriptions. Others were nearly perfect, made by rogue artisans who slipped molds out of monasteries after hours. It's like the black market met the parish bake sale. You sit by the roadside now, poking at your badge with a bit more appreciation. Is it authentic? Probably. But you can't help but wonder if the slightly off-center halo on the saint's head is the result of late-night forging or just divine asymmetry. The badge-making process itself was surprisingly efficient. First, they carved a master mold from stone or soapstone, sometimes even cuttlefish bone. Yes, the same kind parakeets peck at today. Then, molten metal was poured in, hardened, popped out, and trimmed. Some had pins or loops so they could be stitched to cloaks or hats. Others had little bells or moving parts. One particularly creative badge from Cologne featured a saint whose arm lifted in blessing if you tilted it just right. Medieval fidget toy? Perhaps. And while most badges were lead-tin alloy, cheap, soft, and easy to cast, wealthier pilgrims sometimes commissioned silver or even gilded versions. Because nothing says humble spiritual journey quite like flashing your gold-plated St. Barbara to a group of peasants who've been eating boiled moss for 3 days. Still, even the cheapest badges mattered deeply to their owners. They weren't mere souvenirs. They were proof. Proof that you had walked, prayed, slept under trees, endured miracle plays, and survived Brother Psalms-a-Lot's endless recitations. They were tokens of effort, of faith, of stories lived and stories shared. As darkness folds across the land, you build a tiny fire beside a hedgerow. The stars blink on overhead. Shy at first, then confidently spilling across the sky. You sip a bit of sour wine and chew on a heel of bread that's attempting to become a brick. And beside you, tucked safely in your pack, your badge rests, warm from your touch. Quirky tidbit incoming. Some badge makers, especially in the Low Countries, signed their work. Not with a signature, but with a tiny symbol carved subtly into the mold. A crescent moon, a squirrel, a pair of scissors. A few modern archaeologists have become low-key obsessed with tracing these symbols, mapping the mysterious badge artisans of medieval Europe like detective historians with very small magnifying glasses. You shift slightly on the mossy bank and feel something sharp in your cloak pocket. Another badge, the one you nearly forgot about from St. Gudula's shrine. She's the one who supposedly warded off evil spirits with candles. The badge shows her holding one aloft, while a tiny demon scowls nearby like he's been caught smoking behind the abbey. There's something oddly comforting about these little metal tokens, like they're part of a conversation that's still going. You're holding a story that someone else, long ago, thought worth telling. And as the fire flickers low and your eyelids grow heavy, you wonder how many other badges lie buried beneath the earth, waiting quietly for curious hands and curious minds, waiting to whisper, once again, the tales they carry. The morning mist settles on your cloak like a ghost, trying to give you a polite hug. Dew beads along your boots as you step back onto the narrow trail, badge tucked safely in your pouch. Today's stretch is longer, quieter, and more reflective. You're well past the bustling towns and miracle hotspots now, winding through fields where even the sheep seem too sleepy to acknowledge your presence. But don't let the stillness fool you. Pilgrimage paths weren't all peace and chanting monks. Today, your thoughts begin to wander, specifically to the pilgrim gangs, the travel partners, and the mismatched troops that formed along the way. You're not walking alone anymore. You're with the motley crew. See, medieval pilgrimage was rarely a solo endeavor. Sure, the very devout or very dramatic might attempt to go it alone, but most people quickly realized that safety, food, and conversation all improved exponentially when shared. And so informal walking collectives popped up. Strangers turned temporary family, bound by sore feet, shared bread, and occasional arguments over who snores the loudest. Some groups were organized before departure, especially among wealthier folks or parish outings. Picture 30 or 40 people from the same village, wearing matching badges, led by a local priest who is desperately trying to keep young Will and Martha from canoodling behind every hedgerow. Other groups? Total chaos. You'd meet someone at a crossroads, trade a story or two, and suddenly you're traveling companions for 3 weeks because they loaned you a chunk of honeycomb and didn't judge your ankle blisters. Mainstream historical fact time. In the 14th century, pilgrimage societies became so common that they had their own set of rules, songs, and even flags. Some were based around guilds or trades, like the fishmongers of London who marched to Walsingham annually, or even families of badge makers. Others formed around a shared devotion, like the many Friends of St. James brotherhoods that cropped up along the Camino. But here's where things get delightfully weird. A few records tell us of performance troupes forming along pilgrim routes. Yes, imagine strolling toward Canterbury, and suddenly a lanky juggler and a lute-playing widow ask if you'd like to join their traveling holy theater. You say yes, obviously, and 2 days later you're dressed as a talking donkey in a field reenactment of Balaam and the Angel. It's weirdly specific, and historians still argue whether these roving players were tolerated, celebrated, or quietly ignored by more traditional pilgrims. Speaking of disagreements, it turns out that not all pilgrim groups were filled with harmony. One famous feud, recorded in a margin note of a 15th century German prayer book, involved a French monk and a Dutch brewer who argued for 3 straight days about whether or not relics should be kissed with tongue. Still, group travel had its perks. Shared tents, communal cooking, and the ability to pool resources for hiring a guide through dodgy terrain or a translator when entering a region with an entirely different dialect. One chronicler, writing in a tone that suggests he was deeply over it, mentioned a band of 5 Flemish pilgrims who refused to believe anyone in Spain was not secretly French. They proceeded to shout increasingly slow French at confused innkeepers for weeks. Quirky tidbit? A few surviving badges seem to depict not saints, but the pilgrims themselves. One from northern Italy shows a group of tiny stick-like figures linked arm in arm, smiling up at the wearer. Were these keepsakes from a particular journey? A tiny reunion badge? A medieval version of, I survived the Camino and all I got was this? We don't know, but the warmth in their design suggests deep affection. You look around at your imaginary group now. There's a toothless man from Bruges humming softly, a teenage girl with a pet rabbit in her satchel, a mother and son from Lyon trading dried figs for song requests, They don't speak your dialect perfectly, but the rhythm of walking smooths over the gaps. You learn to point, to nod, to share stories in half words and full laughter. You camp together beneath the trees, watching the firelight dance in the bowls of your supper. Someone's badge catches the light. It's shaped like a boat, marking a shrine near a harbor. He offers to trade, and you consider it for a moment. But no. You'll keep your candle-wielding St. Gudula for now. Still, you offer a bit of cheese instead, and he smiles wide enough to make his badge jingle. These makeshift families had lifespans of anywhere from a day to a year. Some ended with a tearful goodbye at the shrine steps. Others ended in spectacular arguments over whose turn it was to carry the cooking pot. One 15th century journal tells of a Welsh pilgrim who left his group after someone tried to steal his shoes in the night, only to rejoin them 5 days later, because he missed the company and the stew. There's something deeply human in these fragile friendships. They form, flourish, and fade, just like the trails beneath your feet. And yet they leave marks, not always visible, but unmistakable. That song you learned, that prayer in a different tongue. That slightly annoying man from Avignon, who always walked too fast and ate the last plum. As the stars peek out again, you curl beneath your cloak and listen to the soft breaths of your temporary family. You think about the thousands of groups who once walked this same path, the millions of feet that have pressed into this dirt, the laughter, the complaints, the sleepy stories told as fireflies danced above sleeping bags made from straw. And you smile, because for this moment you are one of them. The road narrows, winding now through a stretch of forest that smells like pine resin and last night's rain. The trees lean in close, whispering to each other in creaks and rustles. Your feet crunch on the path's damp leaves, and every so often you catch the glimmer of something metallic half buried in the dirt. Another badge, maybe? Or just a bottle cap from a careless modern hiker? Hard to tell in this light. Your mind drifts, not to the destination, but to the side quests. Not every miracle lay along the straight and narrow route. In fact, some of the most popular pilgrim shrines were gloriously inconvenient. Remote chapels perched on cliff edges, crumbling monasteries up 3,000 uneven steps, tiny caves where a saint supposedly sneezed once. And you better believe people went out of their way for those. This is the era of the pilgrimage detour, a time when a decent rumor was all it took to get a group of blistered travelers to veer off into the marshes to find a holy turnip. Let's start with a mainstream historical fact. One of the most famous of these detours was Rocamadour in France, a cluster of chapels clinging to a cliffside like a stack of playing cards that refused to fall. Pilgrims diverted from the main roads to climb its 216 steps, often on their knees, in the hope of earning just a little extra divine favor. The badge? A simple image of the Madonna, often accompanied by the stairs. But not all detours were this well documented. Some were downright suspicious. You might be 2 weeks into your journey when someone whispers about a hermit 2 valleys over, who speaks only in biblical riddles and blesses buttons. Suddenly, you and 4 new friends are trudging up a goat path in the rain, hoping your buttons are feeling especially pious. Quirky tidbit. One English pilgrim in the 15th century recorded in his travel journal that he walked 3 days to see the bones of St. Godeliev's dog, only to find out the dog was, in fact, a wooden carving. He was disappointed, but not enough to skip the souvenir badge, which depicted a sleepy-looking spaniel in a halo. Historians still argue whether these detours were encouraged by church authorities or merely tolerated. On one hand, they increased devotion and tourism. On the other, too many distractions might keep pilgrims from reaching their official destination, and from dropping coins into the right collection boxes. Some shrines were even suspected of badge piracy, where rival sites would create knockoff versions of popular badges to sell to unsuspecting pilgrims passing through. You step over a knotted route and think about that. Badge piracy. The medieval equivalent of buying a Calvin Klein shirt in a back alley. It's possible some of those shiny tokens you've been collecting were not, in fact, blessed in the flickering candlelight of a real shrine, but instead hammered out behind a tavern by someone named Jeff, who's never even seen a saint, let alone met one. Yet, does it matter? After all, it's not the badge itself, but the meaning you attach to it, right? Another favorite side quest among medieval pilgrims involved water, especially holy wells. From Ireland to Iberia, springs that bubbled mysteriously or tasted vaguely metallic were assumed to have miraculous properties. Never mind the bacteria count. If a saint once bathed their sore foot in it, you'd better believe it could cure anything from gout to a bad marriage. Take St. Winifred's Well in Wales, a cool, deep pool fed by a spring that supposedly burst forth where her severed head landed. Cheerful origin story, right? Pilgrims flocked there to bathe, pray, and purchase tiny metal badges in the shape of a running spring. One account from the 1300s even claims a man was cured of hiccups after 3 sips. You haven't had hiccups in years, but suddenly you wish you had, just to test it. There were stranger detours, too. A chapel carved into volcanic rock in Sicily, where the walls supposedly sweated oil. A rock in northern Spain shaped vaguely like a human foot. Pilgrims stepped in it to ensure their journey would be smooth, which it rarely was. Or the famed Weeping Stone near Cologne, which could cry on command if tickled correctly. No, really. As you stroll, you recall the stories told around campfires, how the detours often ended up more memorable than the main route. A German pilgrim once wandered so far off track trying to find a miraculous talking goose that he missed Santiago entirely and ended up back where he started, with nothing but a goose feather in his cap and a story no one believed. There's a badge for that too, or at least there should be. Open scholarly debate. Historians still can't decide whether pilgrims really believed in the power of these minor shrines, or if the detours were simply an excuse to prolong the journey, experience something new, or avoid going home too quickly. Was it piety? Boredom? Spiritual FOMO? The answer is probably yes. You reach a bend in the path where the trees part to reveal a crooked chapel ruin. Ivy coils up what remains of the doorway. The altar is long gone, but someone, recently, has left a tiny candle burning in a jar. You pause. This isn't a major stop. It might not even be on the map. But someone came here. Someone prayed. Maybe it was once a detour. Maybe now it's the destination. And nestled by the jar, a small metal badge, rusted, weathered, shaped like a scallop shell, the symbol of pilgrimage. You could take it, add it to your collection, or you could leave it. Let the next weary traveler find it and feel, just for a moment, like the journey was watching out for them too. You turn back to the path, the forest rustling behind you. Another detour considered. Another story waiting to be told. You follow a narrow lane now, the kind where brambles try to shake your hand, and moss has replaced most of the road. The kind that isn't on modern maps, but that someone, once, considered sacred enough to walk barefoot in winter. Your steps squelch a little from last night's rain, and you start to think about the badges again. Not the shapes or the saints, but how they were made in the first place. They didn't fall out of the sky, after all. And for every starry-eyed pilgrim clasping a badge to their chest, there was someone else sweating over a tiny mold and worrying whether the tin had enough lead in it to hold its shape. Welcome to the wonderfully mundane world of medieval badge making. Let's start with the mainstream historical fact. The vast majority of medieval pilgrimage badges were made using a method called open-face casting. A mold was carved, often into a small slab of cuttlefish bone or soapstone, and then molten metal was poured in. Once cooled, the badge was popped out, trimmed with a small file, and sometimes painted or gilded, though many remained the dull gray of pewter or lead alloy. These were not artisanal masterpieces. They were quick, cheap, and plentiful. Think less Fabergé egg and more keychain from a highway rest stop. But that's what made them beautiful in their own right. Affordable proof that you'd done something extraordinary, or at least exhausting. Most major shrines had dedicated badge workshops set up close by. Picture a tiny stall crowded with scraps of metal, sizzling pots, and someone with strong forearms shouting at an apprentice to stir clockwise or ruin the Virgin's face again. These little operations churned out thousands of badges during peak seasons. Canterbury alone may have produced tens of thousands annually in its heyday, and these were sold right outside the cathedral, alongside candles, relic vials, and the occasional suspicious-looking jar of Saint-Blessed ointment that smelled like goat. Quirky tidbit? Some badges were made using two-part molds, allowing for rudimentary three-dimensional shapes. One popular badge from the Shrine of St. William of York featured the saint's face, but if you flipped it over, the back was also his face. That's right, double-faced William. Was it symbolic? A printing error? Or just someone getting creative after a long lunch? Historians still aren't sure, but it definitely turned heads. Badge makers often reused molds until they cracked or warped, which means the same badge from the same shrine could look slightly different over the years. St. James's smile slowly drooping as the mold aged, like he was increasingly fed up with his own popularity. You imagine yourself walking into one of these medieval workshops. The heat is oppressive, even in spring. There's a thick smell of metal and old cloth, and you duck to avoid the wooden beam that everyone else seems to forget is there. A grizzled man with soot-covered hands gestures at a pile of rejects, badges where the saint has no nose, or the text is backwards. "Take one," he grunts. "Only a penny. Might still work." Historians still argue whether the badges were blessed before or after purchase, or at all. Some suggest that only the ones bought inside the church walls received an official blessing, while others say the sheer act of wearing one on a holy journey imbued it with sacred power. There's even evidence that pilgrims sometimes brought their badges home to be blessed by a local priest instead, as if outsourcing the miracle might be more convenient. You round a bend and pass an old stone bridge, half collapsed but still proudly arching its back across a dry creek. Someone has nailed a rusted horseshoe to the remaining handrail. Another talisman, another badge of sorts. You start to wonder if everything could be a badge, if you believed in it hard enough. What did people do with their badges once the journey ended? Some wore them until they crumbled. Others pinned them to hats, cloaks, or even saddlebags, collecting them like medieval flair. There are records of people burying badges with loved ones, hanging them over cradles, or placing them in the walls of new houses for protection. Imagine moving into your new cottage and tapping a tiny pewter Thomas Becket above the hearth, just in case things got spooky after dark. But there was another stranger fate for old badges: melting. Yes, some devout pilgrims, after returning safely from their journeys, would gather their badges and toss them into a fire, or donate them to a local smith to be repurposed into chalices, crosses, or even nails for new church doors. A way of returning the sacred back to the sacred, or perhaps just making space for the next adventure. You picture someone quietly removing a badge from their cloak, kissing it, then letting it sink into the coals. That soft hiss as it turns from token to memory. You wonder if it glowed. And if we're talking materials, yes, many badges were made of lead alloy, often mixed with tin, antimony, or whatever else the badge maker had on hand. Lead was cheap and malleable, though modern archaeologists handling these relics today have to be careful. If your relic shelf contains medieval badges, it's best not to lick them. Not that you were planning on it, but hey, now you know. In some towns, local authorities tried to regulate badge making. Too many unlicensed vendors had popped up, selling dubious designs, like the infamous badge from Cologne depicting the three kings with exaggeratedly large noses, which offended nearly everyone, and was pulled from circulation after public complaint. Badge scandal. Can you imagine the town meeting? But of course, not everyone obeyed. One badge uncovered in London depicted a pilgrim flipping the bird with one hand and holding a scallop shell in the other. Was it satire? Was it a joke badge for someone who hated walking? Either way, it proves that even medieval people had a weird sense of humor. As you press on down the trail, you think about the hands that made your badges. Strong, sooty hands with calloused fingertips and a knack for detail. People who never left their village, but whose creations traveled across Europe on the backs of people like you. The makers rarely got credit. Their initials, if present, were usually scratched on the mold's edge and almost always lost in casting. But their work lived on, in pockets, on cloaks, in graves, and even now beneath a bramble somewhere, waiting for someone to stoop down and discover a story. The sun has mellowed behind a cloud now, turning everything a soft pewter gray. The perfect time to think about something just as murky and mysterious. Counterfeit pilgrimage badges. Yes, that's right. You're not even halfway through your medieval quest when you realize that not every badge handed out near a holy shrine came from the shrine itself. Some came from a guy in a back alley using last year's molds and this morning's lead scraps. Welcome to the shady world of spiritual bootlegging. Let's start with the obvious. People have always found a way to make money from human hope. Pilgrimage badges, as humble as they might seem, were hot sellers. The demand was high, the materials were cheap, and the market essentially unregulated. And so, wherever pilgrims gathered, so too did opportunists with folding tables and suspicious smiles. Mainstream historical fact? By the 14th century, counterfeit badge-making was widespread enough that certain ecclesiastical councils began issuing warnings. In 1390, the Archbishop of Canterbury specifically condemned the sale of fake badges around the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. Apparently, not all tiny faces of the martyred saint were created equal. Some were so badly made that one chronicler compared them to melted hounds. Naturally, the line between fake and real wasn't always clear. For instance, some counterfeiters actually copied badge molds from the originals. Same pose, same lettering, same saint, just manufactured in a neighbor's root cellar instead of a cathedral workshop. Others got a little more creative. A popular variation featured St. George, but instead of slaying a dragon, he's just sitting down and eating a fish. Historians still argue whether this was a parody, a regional reinterpretation, or someone who really misunderstood the assignment. Quirky tidbit? One counterfeit badge uncovered in modern-day Norfolk showed an angel holding what looked suspiciously like a frying pan. No known shrine featured such an image, and researchers are still baffled. Was it a miscast relic? A badge for a long-lost culinary saint? Or did someone, somewhere, genuinely believe they'd received divine inspiration while flipping eggs? You trudge onward, the path narrowing now into two clear grooves, worn into the earth by centuries of feet. You picture yourself passing a market stall back in 1422, eyeing a shiny badge that looks, well, almost like the one your friend bought yesterday. The edges are off. The saint's beard is a little too curly, and the Latin reads more like Sanctus Brisket than anything remotely spiritual. Still, you hand over a few coins, telling yourself it's close enough. You just walked 200 miles in sandals, forgive you. Some fakes were harmless, intended as souvenirs rather than sacred items. Think of them as medieval knockoff t-shirts. I went to Compostela, and all I got was this tin badge. But others were deliberately deceitful, passed off as relics of genuine power, capable of healing, blessing, or warding off demons with the power of a melted spoon and a hopeful sales pitch. Of course, not everyone was fooled. Church officials occasionally launched investigations, confiscated counterfeit molds, and even levied fines on rogue badge makers. Yet for every dishonest craftsman shut down, 2 more popped up in the next town over, cheerfully selling miraculous St. Felix badges that looked suspiciously like overcooked pancakes. And then there were the pilgrims themselves, who, let's be honest, weren't always buying for spiritual reasons. Sure, some believed the badge held power, but many just wanted proof that they'd made it, that they'd endured the mud, the blisters, the overcooked lentils, and survived. For those folks, a badge was a social receipt. Whether it came from the cathedral's finest smithy or Jeff's garage of dubious icons didn't always matter. It's easy to judge from a modern distance, but you imagine arriving in a medieval city after days of slogging through cold rain, and a cheerful woman offers you a badge for half the usual price. She swears it's genuine. You look at it. You look at your coin purse. You nod. And in that moment, you too join the long tradition of fake badge enthusiasts. Interestingly, some fakes have since become collectors' favorites. Because of their rarity, or sheer oddity, they're now highly prized by museums and historians. A particularly bizarre badge discovered in the Thames shows what might be the Virgin Mary, riding a fish. Or maybe it's a bishop. The metal is worn, the details blurred, but the image lingers in your mind like a dream you're not sure you had. Counterfeit badges weren't always worse in quality, by the way. Some were better. Sharper detail, nicer metal, smoother casting. It's as if the forgers were trying to prove a point. Just because it's unofficial doesn't mean it's sloppy. Sometimes, they were even ahead of their time. A few badge designs found only in forgeries eventually inspired real ones, like a sort of reverse miracle where the fake led the faith. Historians still argue whether the church's disdain for counterfeit badges was about protecting pilgrims' souls or protecting cathedral revenue. After all, a counterfeit badge sold outside the shrine was a penny not spent at the official gift table. And with thousands of visitors passing through each year, that was no small loss. You reach a small crossroads where a weathered signpost points in 3 directions, all of them faded. You pick the middle path, because that's what a proper pilgrim does. Behind you, the sound of a cow sneezing. You hope that's what it was. The badge you imagine in your pocket now feels heavier. Was it made by candlelight, lovingly detailed by a true believer? Or was it pressed out in someone's shed while they hummed an off-key drinking song? Either way, it's part of the story now. Your story. And who knows? Maybe it doesn't matter whether it's real or fake. Maybe the journey gives it meaning, not the mold. After all, belief is a funny thing. You carry a charm, a symbol, a scrap of tin, and it becomes courage, protection, a whisper of home. And perhaps that's what made counterfeit badges thrive. Not deception, but desire. A longing to hold something, anything, that says, I walked the miles, I saw the saints, I mattered. Your path winds onward now, climbing gently through a slope of wild thyme and scattered boulders, the kind of terrain that makes your ankles sing sad songs. But your mind wanders too, this time towards something as timeless as the trek itself. The art of storytelling among pilgrims. After all, you didn't walk 5 weeks just for scenery and sore feet. Along the road, one of the true comforts, perhaps even greater than a warm bowl of porridge or a dry place to sit, was the way fellow travelers wove tales to pass the time. Pilgrimage was rarely a silent endeavor. No, it was a low murmuring tide of shared legends, confessions, gossip, and wildly questionable miracle reports. Mainstream historical fact. Storytelling was integral to medieval pilgrimages. Monks, minstrels, merchants, and mothers all shared tales, both sacred and scandalous. Some of these stories survive today, tucked inside manuscripts or repurposed in works like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. But most were spoken, ephemeral, carried on the wind between trudging feet. A popular form was the saint's miracle tale. Someone's cousin's brother once touched a saint's relic and was cured of a mysterious elbow rash. Or a man who doubted a relic's power fell over dead after sneezing 3 times. Proof enough for everyone involved. These stories weren't just entertaining. They reinforced belief, soothed doubt, and added spiritual sparkle to the dusty slog. You walk beside a baker from Dijon now, in your imagination, who's telling you about a local monk who once tamed a swarm of bees by reciting the Lord's Prayer backward. You nod along, half curious, half confused, unsure whether to be impressed or concerned. He swears it's true, of course. His grandmother saw it herself, probably. Quirky tidbit? One medieval story involved a pair of pilgrims who got into a fierce argument over whether Saint Barbara preferred barley or rye bread as an offering. The debate lasted 4 villages, 2 fistfights, and a short detour to a local abbey, where a bemused nun declared Saint Barbara would likely prefer people just behave themselves. Whether the tale is true or a long-standing in-joke among pilgrims remains delightfully unclear. Storytelling served other purposes too. It passed the time, eased fear, and helped forge bonds. A shared story could turn strangers into companions, companions into lifelong friends. A good tale helped make the miles disappear, if only for a little while. And when you're hobbling toward Santiago with a sprained toe and damp socks, a little while feels like a miracle. The tone of the stories varied. Some were deeply reverent, testimonies of divine intervention, accounts of martyrdom, legends that layered moral lessons with celestial pyrotechnics. Others were slyly humorous, poking fun at greedy abbots, bumbling kings, or miracles that conveniently happened just after someone paid a small fee. Think of them as holy stand-up routines with a touch of incense. Historians still argue whether these tales were mostly passed down orally, or if more pilgrims were literate than we assume. There's evidence of small pocket-sized books of saints' lives, meant to be read aloud around campfires. But the reality? Most pilgrims couldn't read, so the spoken word reigned supreme. And as we all know, a spoken story grows legs, and sometimes wings. You imagine a weary group of pilgrims curled around a modest fire at twilight, sharing roasted chestnuts and tales of wonder. One man recounts how St. Christopher once appeared to him as a talking mule. Another woman tells of a relic that glowed in the dark and made soup taste better. There's a lot of nodding, a little laughing, and not nearly enough disbelief to satisfy a modern mind. But belief, you realize, didn't always require proof. Just a good story, and the right company. Of course, not all stories were uplifting. Some warned of dangers, bandits, storms, or demons lurking near crossroads, and these too had their place. A little fear helped keep a pilgrim alert, even if it meant checking under your hay-stuffed pillow for invisible mischief makers. One persistent tale involved a wandering demon who posed as a kindly friar and gave extremely bad directions. His favorite pastime? Leading pilgrims into nettle thickets and mud pits. If that doesn't sum up medieval travel, nothing does. Occasionally, you'd find an entertainer who made storytelling a performance. A man with a tambourine and a half-decent singing voice could become a walking podcast, collecting coins and crusts of bread in exchange for a verse or two. Some told bawdy tales in coded language to avoid censure, Others specialized in riddles or improvisations. You might even run into a woman who claimed her stories came from visions granted by Saint Clair, despite the fact that Saint Clair was famously not a fan of long walks or noisy gatherings. The important thing is, the stories gave meaning to the miles. When your knees ached and the rain made your pack smell like wet goat, a tale of radiant relics or saintly interventions made everything feel worthwhile. You weren't just trudging across Europe in borrowed boots. You were retracing steps walked by heroes, fools, and dreamers alike. One favorite among pilgrims was the tale of the miraculous chicken of Santo Domingo. In short, a falsely accused boy is hanged, but miraculously survives. His parents, upon hearing that he's alive, alert the local magistrate, who is, inconveniently, enjoying a roast chicken. The official scoffs, saying the boy is as alive as the bird on his plate. At which point, the chicken stands up and crows. The pilgrims love it. You love it. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crows. And the best part? These stories changed with the telling. A tale heard in Bruges might sound quite different when retold in Bologna. Names, details, even morals shifted. The miracle stayed the same, but the flavor varied, like stew made by many hands. Some pilgrims would even collect stories like badges, souvenirs of the soul. You settle into your pace now, listening for the next story from the lips of your fellow traveler, or maybe from your own imagination. You realize that, just like the badges themselves, these tales were tokens, evidence that you'd walked, wondered, and maybe even believed just a little. Because when the stars came out and the fire crackled low, all a pilgrim really needed was warm feet, a crumb of bread, and a story worth telling again. Your steps slow a little now as the road narrows between hedgerows, thick with dew-soaked leaves, and the occasional goat nibbling suspiciously close to your hem. And it's in these quieter stretches that your thoughts turn to what awaits at the end of all this trudging. Specifically, the booming business of pilgrim souvenirs. Yes, today we're strolling straight into the medieval version of a gift shop. Brace yourself for trinkets, relics, and a whole economy of holy mementos. See, when you finally arrive at your destination, whether it's the shrine of St. James in Compostela, Thomas Becket in Canterbury, or any number of lesser-known but equally miraculous saints across Europe, you don't just pray, light a candle, and go home. No, you queue up at the shrine shop to buy something tangible. Something that says, I came, I wept, I walked several hundred miles on sore knees, and all I got was this pewter shell. And it wasn't just the scallop shell of Santiago that proved popular. That was a classic, sure, but there were entire industries based around badge production. Local artisans, often based right outside cathedral gates or near monastic towns, had mastered the art of pressing soft metals into elaborate little shapes. Saints with flowing robes, towers pierced by arrows, hands, feet, eyes, all symbolizing some divine narrative or miraculous cure. Mainstream historical fact? By the 14th century, pilgrim badges were mass-produced across Europe, particularly in centers like Paris, Cologne, and Canterbury. Molds were reused, designs copied, and by some accounts, vendors even engaged in a bit of marketing rivalry, positioning their badge stands closer to the shrine or offering limited edition designs for certain feast days. And yes, if you're wondering, pilgrim badge knockoffs were totally a thing. Not everyone could afford the authentic pressed lead token from the shrine itself. So just outside the holy grounds, cheaper versions were sold. Some possibly blessed, others only slightly suspicious in origin. Imagine buying a genuine Becket badge only to find it's actually Saint Olaf in a funny hat. Historians still argue whether pilgrims genuinely believed in the miraculous power of these items or simply saw them as physical reminders of their spiritual journey. The truth, as usual, is likely somewhere in between. For some, a badge was protection, proof of penance, or a lucky charm. For others, it was a social flex. Look at this one. You can almost hear them say, "I went all the way to Cologne. My cousin only made it to Durham." You spot a few fellow pilgrims ahead, badges already clinking proudly from their cloaks and caps. Some have a whole flutter of them, like medieval Boy Scouts. Each one represents a stop, a story, or a miracle claimed along the way. Some even wear them around their necks or sew them to their walking sticks. It's not exactly subtle. You'd think they were sponsored. There's one particularly memorable badge that's shaped like a loaf of bread, meant to commemorate a saint who miraculously fed a starving crowd with one suspiciously elastic baguette. Another resembles a pair of sandals, allegedly St. Jerome's, though historians are fairly sure Jerome preferred going barefoot. But who's checking receipts? A quirky tidbit? In some cases, badge molds themselves were shaped like body parts, the kind afflicted pilgrims hoped to heal. Got a dodgy knee? There's a badge for that. Sore eyes from all the candlelight and questionable beer? There's one shaped like an eyeball, unsettling but oddly specific. You could practically build a whole Frankensaint from the parts on display. The badge business wasn't just about money. It created jobs, supported local economies, and gave rise to entire artisan communities. Pewterers, mold makers, engravers, they all found steady work in the holy souvenir market. And their handiwork wasn't always crude. Some badges were works of tiny, devotional art, featuring intricate reliefs of saints, angels, and moments of divine drama. The better the detail, the higher the price, and the more envious your friends back home. Naturally, this thriving economy caught the attention of church authorities. Some monasteries tried to regulate sales, issuing official designs or requiring vendors to pay fees. Others leaned into the badge boom entirely, setting up their own workshops and cutting out the middleman. Hey, if the pilgrims were going to spend their money anyway, better it stay in holy hands, right? Now, imagine the moment you finally reach the shrine. After hours, possibly days, of waiting behind other pilgrims, you shuffle forward, cloak damp, feet sore, eyes wide. Incense fills the air, candlelight flickers against golden reliquaries, and a hush settles over the space like snowfall. You kneel, murmur your prayers, maybe touch the shrine or press your badge against it, hoping for a trace of holiness to transfer. And then, reverently, or perhaps just hungrily, you back away and head straight for the vendor's stall. You browse the options. Do you want the standard issue shell? The special feast day edition with gold embossing? Or perhaps the novelty one with a smiling St. Denis holding his own severed head like he's mid-stand-up routine? Hard to choose. Eventually you settle on 1 or 2 or 5 and pin them proudly to your gear. They jingle faintly as you walk away, a kind of musical reminder of the miles behind you. And when you finally return home, dusty and a bit holier, those little tokens speak for you. They say you made it, you endured, you believed, or tried to. It's comforting in its way. A badge might not cure your bunions or absolve your debts, but it holds something no one can quite define. A memory, maybe, a story, a small weight that anchors you to a moment when you stood in the presence of something bigger than yourself. Whether that was divine grace or just a really solid roast pigeon you had outside the abbey gates. You pass a field now, the wind playing a lazy tune through the grasses. A boy runs by, pointing to your badges and grinning. You grin back, because you've earned every step, every blister, and every tiny, jangling souvenir. You're still walking, the path dipping gently now through a wooded hollow where the light gets filtered through leaves, and time itself seems to slow. Your shoulders ache a little less, the rhythm of your stride more automatic with every mile. And as you trudge on, Jingling slightly from your well-earned badges, your thoughts drift toward something you've probably noticed along the way. Strange customs that feel, well, more than a little theatrical. We're talking about the many performative acts of devotion medieval pilgrims engaged in. Displays that, depending on your angle, are either deeply moving or borderline over the top. Flagellants, barefoot walkers, chains around waists, crawling the last mile on hands and knees. You name it. If it could be endured, somebody did it in the name of penance or piety. Mainstream historical fact? Pilgrimage wasn't always just a quiet walk with the occasional shrine stop. Some pilgrims turned it into a living tableau of spiritual suffering. In the 13th and 14th centuries, processions of flagellants, groups of people publicly whipping themselves, marched through towns across Europe during periods of plague and crisis. They weren't just trying to scare their neighbors. They believed that shared, visible suffering could earn divine forgiveness for entire communities. And yet this performative pain wasn't limited to extreme cases. Even on ordinary pilgrimages, many people took up additional challenges to show sincerity or earn greater favor. You might vow to walk barefoot the entire route, even across stony riverbeds, or swear not to speak for the journey's duration. A silent, dusty mime drifting along the road like an existential wind chime. One of the more curious fringe practices? Some penitents wore heavy iron collars or even dragged chains behind them, clanking and rattling with each step like a very determined ghost. These weren't fashion statements, though you'd be surprised how quickly the look caught on in certain circles. They were visible reminders that the wearer bore guilt, pain, or a vow in progress. Historians still debate the line between genuine religious fervor and social theater. Was this all heartfelt devotion, or a bit of spiritual one-upmanship? The medieval version of I do yoga, but like intensely. Probably a blend of both. After all, if you're going to suffer publicly, there's no harm in a little admiration from the peanut gallery. And oh, what a gallery it was. Crowds often lined major pilgrimage routes, not just to pray or join in, but to watch, to see who was passing through, what weird and wonderful customs they brought, what languages they spoke, what saints they praised. A multicultural roadside theater troupe without costumes, though with a surprising number of bells. Some pilgrims even staged tiny reenactments of biblical stories or the lives of saints. In one German account, a particularly devout group spent a whole afternoon staging the Passion of Christ in a roadside meadow, complete with roles, dialogue, and, wait for it, audience snacks. You remember passing a woman earlier, rosary clutched in one hand, the other dragging a small wooden cross behind her. Not full-sized, this isn't an action film, but enough to feel like something. She said nothing, just kept walking, eyes locked on the horizon. Did she lose a loved one? Was she praying for rain, or forgiveness, or safe childbirth? You didn't ask. You just nodded, and she nodded back, and the two of you went on. Some of these acts were spontaneous, individual decisions. Others were bound up in local tradition. In parts of Spain and Portugal, pilgrims still approach certain shrines on their knees, often in organized groups, chanting softly through the dust. In Ireland, the pilgrimage to Croagh Patrick involves climbing a stony mountain, sometimes barefoot, despite modern signage begging you not to. And then there are the sleepwalkers. Okay, not literally, but you pass more than a few folks who seem half aware, deep in meditative motion, muttering prayers like lullabies. They look through you, not at you, caught somewhere between faith and fatigue. You wonder if you look the same. The deeper meaning of all these performances is wrapped up in medieval views of the body. Pain was considered purifying. Suffering was a kind of divine alignment, proof that you were doing your spiritual math correctly. And showing that pain? That was part of the equation. It made your inner transformation visible. But, as with anything involving people, it wasn't all pure motives and holy sweat. Some pilgrims got a reputation for putting on a bit of a show, over-dramatizing their devotion in ways that, shall we say, conveniently drew attention. There are records of travelers competing over how hard their journeys were. "Oh, you fasted for 7 days? I fasted for 10, and wore nettles, on purpose." You pass a young man now sitting on a stone wall, rubbing his feet and dramatically sighing. His traveling companion rolls her eyes and tosses him a piece of bread. Clearly not impressed. There's always one in every group, a quirky little practice, less painful but still theatrical. Some pilgrims carried musical instruments, not to play necessarily, but as symbolic objects. A harp for Saint Cecilia, a bell for Saint Anthony, a tiny wooden flute dedicated to some local shepherd saint. Occasionally, someone would break into song, usually off-key, occasionally deeply moving. You still hum one of the chants you heard a few days ago, its rhythm matching your steps. One final observation as you continue onward. These performative acts didn't just affect the individual pilgrim. They shaped how communities perceived the whole idea of pilgrimage. To see someone walking barefoot in rags, or weeping beside a roadside cross, was to see faith made flesh. It challenged you, unsettled you, maybe inspired you, or maybe made you want to take a nap. Both are valid. Your road bends west again, and the light is starting to dip, the trees growing longer shadows that stretch across the path like soft fingers. You adjust your cloak, feel your badges press gently into your chest, and think, not for the first time, that perhaps the performance wasn't just for others. Maybe, in repeating the motions, the words, the rituals, you convinced yourself a little more with each step. And really, what is faith, if not a rehearsal? The road today has leveled out a little, winding through low fields where wind sighs across wild grasses and larks spiral up toward the sky like prayers that forgot their direction. Your legs ache in a familiar way now, like an old friend tapping on your shins with tiny wooden hammers. But your mind, that's oddly alert. Which is perfect, because today you're passing through a town that's famous, or perhaps infamous, for a very particular kind of pilgrim. The fakers. Yes, that's right. The medieval world had its fair share of bogus badge collectors, people who made the sacred journey for reasons that had very little to do with, say, spiritual awakening. Some wanted to avoid taxes, skip jury duty, or escape bad marriages. Others were just after a bit of coin, a warm bed, or the sheer novelty of it all. Mainstream historical fact? By the late Middle Ages, so many people had taken up the pilgrim's staff that civic authorities had to introduce laws to curb fake pilgrimages. One English law in the 14th century required all travelers claiming to be on pilgrimage to carry official letters of pilgrimage from their home parishes, sort of like a medieval hall pass, stamped by your priest instead of your homeroom teacher. But even with these precautions, the road was teeming with questionable characters. Some would buy pilgrim gear secondhand, badges, cloaks, staffs, and put on the whole ensemble like a costume. You might think of it as early cosplay, only instead of portraying a Jedi, you were pretending to be spiritually reborn and mildly footsore. One colorful character described in medieval records was a man who made the rounds of English shrines each summer, giving dramatic testimonies about how he'd been healed by various saints. The problem? The injury he described changed each time. One week it was a limp. The next, partial blindness. Someone finally caught on when he dramatically collapsed in a town square and forgot which leg he was meant to be favoring. Historians still argue whether the majority of these so-called fakers were malicious scammers or simply people navigating a complex system with the tools they had. After all, life was hard. If a pilgrimage earned you sympathy, food, or a bed for the night, who could blame you for slipping on a scallop shell or two? But it wasn't just the itinerant con men that caused concern. Some professional entertainers took to the roads, posing as pilgrims while performing songs, puppet shows, or acrobatics, in exchange for food or coin, of course. One traveling juggler named Perrault reportedly told fortunes with seashells blessed by St. James. Were they truly blessed? Well, let's just say Perrault was never spotted anywhere near Santiago. There were also the relic sellers, the shady middlemen who hawked objects of dubious origin. Think, this toenail definitely belonged to St. Peter, or, behold, the authentic walking stick of St. Ursula, only 3 left in stock. Pilgrims bought them, either as spiritual insurance or as conversation pieces. The church tried to crack down, but it was like playing whack-a-mole with incense. A particularly notorious scam involved fake badges. Some towns, desperate to capitalize on the growing pilgrim economy, would forge copies of more famous badges and sell them at their local shrines. This led to a quiet little badge black market, where savvy pilgrims could compare scallop shell angles like art historians spotting a forgery. One Flemish merchant even wrote a pocket guide to identifying true badges of holy origin. Medieval Consumer Reports, anyone? Of course, it wasn't all nefarious. Sometimes pilgrims faked parts of their journey not for profit, but for pride. A merchant who took a pilgrimage to Rome might later embellish the story, adding a dramatic thunderstorm, a near mugging, maybe a conversation with a talking donkey. Okay, that last one's unlikely, unless you're mixing your hagiographies with your fairy tales. But these exaggerations, like all good travel stories, were part of the experience. A little embroidery on the truth made your pilgrimage more memorable, more meaningful, or at least more entertaining at feasts. Because let's be honest, I walked 400 miles and it rained once. Doesn't quite land as well as I survived 3 bandits, a lightning storm, and a monastery with haunted sausages. You walk past a weathered signpost now, the wood splintered and the names barely legible. Someone's carved a small spiral into the side. Maybe a badge peddler's mark, maybe just a pilgrim passing time with a penknife. Either way, it's a reminder. Everyone who passes here leaves something behind. A lie, a truth, a bit of themselves. And not all fakery was frowned upon. Some performances were so embedded in pilgrimage culture that they became expected. The famous Pilgrim stories, recounted by Chaucer's characters in the Canterbury Tales, blend truth, exaggeration, and outright fantasy. Chaucer himself was poking gentle fun at the line between sincere devotion and theatrical nonsense. Sound familiar? Still, some pilgrims took offense. Real ones, that is. There are reports of angry confrontations when honest pilgrims found themselves lumped in with the badge hustlers and storybenders. One pious widow from Norwich famously slapped a man who mocked her for carrying 25 badges on her cloak. Her response? "They were all earned, and I'd slap you again if my wrist didn't ache from walking." Quirky side note? Some monks at major shrines developed an informal, fake pilgrim radar. They could reportedly spot insincere travelers by how often they asked about food, whether they knew any prayers, or how clean their boots were. If your cloak was spotless, and your face suspiciously well-shaved, you might be escorted to the less devout guest quarters, right next to the stables. As you crest a small hill, the town behind you fades from view, and ahead lies a quiet stretch of land, golden with late-season wheat. You pass a farmer who nods politely, his donkey chewing something with the weary air of someone who's seen 1,000 pilgrims and isn't impressed by a single one. You can't help but chuckle. Maybe the fakery is part of the charm. Maybe even the lies reveal something honest about what people hoped for, feared, or needed from the road. Maybe everyone, in their own way, fakes it a little. And who's to say a fake pilgrim didn't still find real peace? You wake to the soft sound of sheep somewhere beyond the hedgerow. Their bleating rhythmic and oddly soothing, like a chorus of particularly nasal lullabies. The air is cool and full of dew, and your cloak smells faintly of wood smoke and crushed lavender from last night's rest near an herb garden. Your feet, meanwhile, smell, well, like they've been doing their job. The road today will take you through a quieter part of the pilgrimage route, a stretch known for its modest shrines and the unique tradition of badge stacking. Pilgrims collecting badges not just from the final destination, but from every shrine they passed, creating a sort of wearable travelogue. By now, your own collection is growing. A scallop shell here, a lead rose there, perhaps even a tiny pewter fish that someone swore was blessed by a monk who once saw St. Cuthbert in a puddle. Mainstream historical fact? By the 15th century, some pilgrims were so badge-heavy by journey's end that they jingled faintly as they walked. One chronicler in York wrote of a man arriving with 40 badges sewn onto his hat, shoulders, and cloak hem. He glinted like a miser's purse, the account says, and moved like a festive goat. But it wasn't just about flair. Each badge was a memory, a receipt of sorts, and, perhaps most importantly, a bit of holy insurance. The idea was simple. The more shrines you visited, the more saints would intercede for you. Some even believed that badges retained a fraction of the shrine's spiritual energy, like a medieval version of downloading divine Wi-Fi. As you walk, you pass a small wooden chapel barely wider than a shepherd's hut. Outside, a wizened priest is hammering new nails into a little signboard, shaped like a fish. You offer a coin and step inside. And there, nestled beside a chipped statue of Saint Margaret, is a tiny pile of tin badges. You take one shaped like a heart pierced by a sword. Simple, hand-cut, and clearly local. The priest eyes your growing collection and smiles. Building a suit of armor? He teases. You chuckle. I like a bit of clatter when I walk. He nods. The saints like it too. Easier to hear you coming. Quirky tidbit. In some towns, the sound of jangling badges was actually used by innkeepers and vendors to spot weary pilgrims from a distance. A clinking traveler meant holy business. And, more importantly, business. Entire cottage industries sprang up around badge-stacking pilgrims, with seamstresses sewing special badge cloaks and tinsmiths crafting novelty shapes. Want a badge shaped like St. George jousting a goose? Somewhere, someone made it. Of course, not everyone approved. Church officials occasionally scolded pilgrims for focusing too much on badges and not enough on prayer. One friar in Avignon famously gave a sermon titled, "The Idle Clink of Hollow Faith," which sounds like either a moral lesson or a very experimental folk album. He warned that badges could become mere baubles of pride, distractions from true spiritual devotion. Historians still argue whether badge stacking was mostly sincere or mostly performative. Some say it was a deeply personal expression of faith, like carrying dozens of prayers stitched into your clothes. Others believe it veered dangerously close to superstition, with pilgrims treating badges like talismans or lucky charms. Still, the practice endured, and it wasn't without its emotional depth. Many pilgrims dedicated each badge to someone back home. A sick parent, a friend lost to plague, a child who never made it past infancy. Some even mailed badges back mid-journey, bundled with letters or tied to tokens of affection. And while pilgrim letters are rare, a few survive. In one, a mother writes to her son, "I carry you with me on my shoulder, your name sewn beneath St. Thomas. When the wind whistles, I think he's telling me your prayers." You pass another pilgrim now, a woman perhaps in her 50s, her cloak shimmering with dozens of tiny pewter sunbursts. She nods at you and gestures at your own badges. "Nice shell," she says. "Santiago?" You nod. She taps her own. "Mine's from Vézelay. Smells faintly of cabbage, but it gets the job done." You share a laugh, and then you walk in quiet, companionable steps for a while, badges rustling like leaves in a stiff breeze. And then there's the tale of the badge duel, one of those stories historians can't quite confirm, but secretly enjoy repeating. Two French pilgrims, both badge fanatics, once reportedly argued over whose collection was more complete. To settle the debate, they each laid out their badges in the town square of Rouen and invited passing priests to vote. The winning pilgrim received free lodging that night. The loser? Well, he still had 52 saints on his side. Some badges had moving parts, tiny arms that waved, legs that dangled, miniature swords that spun on a pin. Others were intentionally absurd. One preserved in a museum shows a man being chased by a very angry goose, possibly an inside joke about Saint Martin and the geese that once betrayed his hiding place. Pilgrim humor was alive and well. After all, when your boots are soggy and your dinner was mostly turnip, you learn to find joy where you can, even in a tin duck dangling from your sleeve. As the sun dips lower, casting a golden glow across the fields, you find yourself inspecting your own badges more carefully. Each one a place, a face, a moment. They're not just souvenirs. They're breadcrumbs on the trail of memory. You press forward, listening to the gentle metallic music of your steps, like wind chimes on a cloak. And as twilight thickens around you, you realize something lovely. Even the clank of pewter can be a lullaby if you let it. The road this evening is dusted with the scent of crushed thyme and smoke from a cooking fire somewhere out of sight. You pass under a canopy of whispering beech trees, the sky above blushing from gold into a quiet purple. As twilight settles, your steps begin to slow. The badges on your cloak barely jingle now, their chatter softened by the fabric and fatigue. Up ahead, the faint glow of lanterns leads you to a cluster of tents, an informal pilgrim's rest stop, run not by monks or clergy, but by a group of widows from the local village. They call it the Badge House, though the sign hanging from the gate is just a crude carving of a smiling face surrounded by stars. This place, you quickly learn, has become a stop of reputation not for its piety, but for its nighttime rituals. The Badge Blessing Circle. Mainstream historical fact? Pilgrims often created their own devotional routines and group customs as they traveled. From singing litanies at crossroads to washing each other's feet at milestone markers, these practices helped build camaraderie. The badge blessing tradition is one of the more charming examples recorded in late medieval England, particularly along the route to Walsingham. The evening ritual begins after supper. You sit cross-legged among other road-weary pilgrims in a circle around a fire. Each person holds a badge, chosen either for its sentimental value or for its comic absurdity. Tonight, yours is the scallop shell from Santiago, polished to a soft gleam. Others hold badges shaped like dogs, angels, swords, saints, or one very questionable-looking mermaid. There's a rule: no repeating the same badge 2 nights in a row, lest the saints grow bored. One of the widows, perhaps in her 70s but still sharp as a hawthorn twig, begins the blessing. It's part prayer, part toast, part bedtime story. "May your Saint Anthony keep you safe from thieves," she intones. "May Saint Apollonia protect your teeth from the black bread at breakfast. May your tin badge not melt in the rain like the ones from last Thursday." Laughter ripples through the group. A young merchant snorts into his wine, while an older friar chuckles and raises a pewter chalice with a fish badge wired to the stem. Quirky tidbit? Some badges were designed to be deliberately hilarious. One preserved in an English collection shows the Virgin Mary launching baby Jesus from a catapult. Scholars believe it was satire, meant not to insult, but to mock overly theatrical miracle tales that had become common in pilgrimage folklore. Pilgrims would wear these with a wink and a nod, a reminder not to take every relic seller's pitch too literally. There's another badge, whispered about during the ritual, called the Grinning Abbot. No one is quite sure where it came from, but those who have seen it say it depicts a very jolly monk giving a thumbs up while holding a loaf of bread in one hand and a mug of ale in the other. Possibly apocryphal, but many swear they saw someone wearing it near Canterbury, or maybe it was Norwich, or Bruges. Historians still argue whether such badges actually existed, or were simply medieval memes told over dinner. As the fire crackles and bellies fill with barley stew, the ritual ends in a sleepy chant, a sort of badge lullaby. It's not Latin, not exactly English either, but a sing-song of names, saints, towns, shrines, and herbs, all woven together like a warm woolen braid. You find yourself mumbling along by the third verse. Soon after, a girl offers to mend the loose thread on one of your badges. She threads a bone needle through your cloak, humming softly. "St. Clair likes tidy cloaks," she says. "She was a weaver, after all." You thank her, wondering how many hours she's spent on this road, how many badges she's sewn and songs she's learned. A little boy near the fire proudly displays his badge shaped like a bear on stilts. "For St. Vitus," he announces, because he liked dancing. Someone pats his head and says, "Close enough." The air is gentle now, perfumed with old leaves and wood smoke. One of the widows hands you a cup of hot mead and a bit of cloth to place over your badges as you sleep. To muffle the jingling and keep the saints warm, you lay back beneath a tangle of canvas and stars, and as you drift, the evening scene continues around you. Pilgrims softly snoring, someone gently plucking at a harp, badges twinkling faintly like constellations stitched across every cloak and cowl. You feel as if you're floating in a sea of pewter and wool and stories. Historians still debate the function of these rituals. Were they truly devotional? Or were they, as some suggest, a way to inject levity and community into the grueling journey? Perhaps both. In any case, they left behind no scripture, no decrees, only the warmth of oral tradition, and a few scraps of verse scribbled in the margins of travel diaries. But it's hard to ignore the power of this shared language. Your badge says something to the others, and theirs speak back to you. It's a kind of conversation carried not in words, but in symbols worn close to the heart. As you roll onto your side, the scallop shell presses softly against your chest. You smile. The saints are with you. So is the stew. So is the snoring friar who has definitely stolen your blanket. Still, you're at peace. The road has its rhythm now, and so do you. Sleep comes gently. Even the badges seem to hush themselves. Morning arrives with the scent of damp grass and a single bell ringing somewhere far off, muffled by mist. You blink open your eyes, the coarse wool of your cloak itching slightly against your cheek, and hear the badges of your fellow pilgrims softly clinking as they begin to stir. Someone nearby is boiling water for porridge, and the sleepy crackle of kindling is your cue to rise and stretch the stiffness from your legs. Your cloak is heavier today, not from weariness, though that's certainly present, but from the sheer accumulation of badges now gathered upon it. You count them absent-mindedly as you yawn. St. George, St. Ursula, the Tower badge from Cologne, the scallop from Compostela, even the suspiciously lumpy badge said to depict St. Wilgefortis, patron saint of women who wish to be rid of their husbands. Today's leg of the journey leads toward a larger market town, where, according to a man chewing yesterday's bread with alarming enthusiasm, a badge fair is in full swing. These fairs are part of the pilgrimage economy's slightly more chaotic cousin, a blend of religious homage and full-on medieval merchandising. Mainstream historical fact? Badge fairs were real and bustling events in medieval Europe. Towns like Canterbury, Bruges, and Cologne often hosted massive gatherings during feast days, drawing badge sellers, relic peddlers, musicians, pickpockets, monks, jugglers, and a suspicious number of people selling roasted pigeons on sticks. As you walk, you're joined by a chatty mason with an armload of carved wooden saints. He has no badges of his own, but is curious about yours. He points to one shaped like a pair of crossed keys. "Ah, St. Peter," he says. "Or maybe just the locksmith's guild in disguise." He chuckles. "Hard to tell. The details have softened over time. That's the thing with badges, especially the ones mass-produced in pewter molds. Over time, edges blur. Faces become vague. What was once a radiant Madonna may now resemble a startled owl. And yet, people still wear them. They still matter. At the town gate, you're swept into the festival atmosphere. Streamers flap in the breeze, children chase geese, and a troupe of actors performs a very shouty rendition of St. Christopher's River crossing, in which the Christ child is represented by a cabbage. The badge stalls are lined up like little shrines, each with its own personality. One is orderly, run by a nun who polishes every piece and provides handwritten notes with each purchase. Another is a riot of clashing colors, managed by a man who claims every badge he sells once touched the bones of St. Margaret. When asked how many bones St. Margaret possibly had, he winks and says, "More than you'd think. Quirky tidbit?" Some badge sellers intentionally mislabeled their wares to appeal to different crowds. A sunburst badge might be sold as the emblem of St. Lucia in one town and St. Eligius in another, depending on which saints were trending locally. Medieval marketing. Same badge, new saint, fresh price. As you browse, a boy tugs your sleeve and offers you a badge shaped like a snail riding a knight. You blink. "For courage," he says, utterly serious. "Because snails keep going even with a house on their back." Honestly? That tracks. You buy it. Historians still argue whether all these badges had fixed meanings. Some believe they carried standardized devotional power, a sort of pewter passport for the soul. Others see them more as memory tokens, fragments of places visited, stories heard, prayers whispered beside smoky candlelight. At one stall, a woman gestures you closer and shows you her rarest item. A badge so worn it looks like little more than a blob of pewter, but she swears it's a depiction of St. Brendan's boat, complete with 7 monks and a whale disguised as an island. "Touch it for safe travels," she whispers, though she adds that the last man who bought one fell into a ditch. "Still," she says, "he didn't die. You buy a badge from her anyway. A simple one shaped like a heart wrapped in thorns. No saint is named. Maybe it's just a reminder that the road wears on the inside too." The fair bustles all afternoon. You share some dried figs with a cloth merchant who weaves badges into his belts. He tells you about a distant pilgrimage to a shrine in Ethiopia, where instead of pewter, pilgrims carry bright embroidered patches and string them into necklaces. His cousin went, he says, and came back with a badge that looked like the sun caught in a spider's web. You ask if it's true, and he just shrugs. Who can say? Memory melts faster than tin. You trade a badge with a German pilgrim who can't speak your language, but seems delighted by your fish-shaped brooch. In return, he gives you a tiny angel riding a boar. You nod seriously, as if you've always known what that means. Late in the afternoon, as shadows lengthen and the smell of honey cakes fills the air, you find a quiet bench beneath a tree and examine your growing collection. Some are comic, others reverent, and a few are, well, mysteries. Together they form a kind of map, not of geography, but of stories, of meals shared and blisters endured, of the people you've walked beside and the ones who've passed you by. Even now they clink softly in the breeze, murmuring to one another like old friends. You wonder what your cloak will look like by the end of this journey, how heavy it might feel, or if someday you'll pass it on to someone else, badges and all, and let them add their own footsteps to its fabric. For now, though, you stand, brush the crumbs from your tunic, and step back into the road. The fair behind you fades into song and smoke, and ahead, the path curves gently into the hills. Your badges shimmer as the sun dips low. They know the way, so do you. The road tilts upward, winding through thickets of late summer brambles and sleepy bee-humming hedgerows. You shift your cloak a little to redistribute the growing weight of your badges. Every movement causes a soft, metallic tinkle. Less a fanfare, and more like a chorus of tiny, grumpy spirits who have decided to hitch a ride. As twilight drapes itself gently over the horizon, your path leads you to a modest stone chapel tucked into a bend in the hillside. It's old, properly old, leaning just slightly, as though it's had one too many winters, and is now nodding off where it stands. The walls are streaked with moss, and a crude sign nailed to the door reads, "Pilgrims welcome. No loud singing after Vespers, please." You step inside. The interior is quiet, dimly lit by the faint embers of a fading candle stub. It smells of damp stone and thyme sprigs someone tucked into the rafters long ago. You lower yourself onto a bench and sigh, your knees cracking, your feet giving the kind of complaint only medieval shoes can inspire. There are others here too, murmuring prayers or just sitting in peaceful exhaustion. One elderly woman dozes with a bag of apples in her lap. A monk is snoring softly in a corner, his sandals kicked off, and his hands still clutching a book. You spot a familiar face, a Flemish girl with whom you traded a Saint Apollonia badge 3 towns ago. She grins when she sees it still pinned to your collar. Mainstream historical fact. Chapels like these, called wayside shrines or pilgrim shelters, were common throughout pilgrimage routes. Maintained by monks, widows, or local parish communities, they offered food, rest, and just enough protection from the elements to keep going. You reach into your bag and pull out a crumpled bit of bread and a hardened lump of cheese that would almost certainly qualify as a weapon in some jurisdictions. But hunger has a way of forgiving texture, and you eat it slowly while watching the candle gutter out. A young boy in the corner begins fiddling with his collection of badges. They're sewn in a jagged line down one sleeve, each one different. You recognize a few: the Canterbury ampulla, the Cologne wheel, even a badge from the cult of Saint Roch. He of the tiny, heroic dog. One badge you don't recognize looks like a spiky lump with what might be a pair of praying hands, or possibly a hedgehog. You lean over and ask, gently, "What's that one?" The boy beams. "It's from a saint in my village. He stopped a thunderstorm with only his hat." You blink. "Impressive." He nods solemnly. "We still don't know where the hat went." Historians still argue whether local saints and their accompanying badges were authentic relics or the results of some very enthusiastic folklore. Some of these lesser-known figures had very localized appeal. A saint whose miracle involved a missing pig might be revered in one valley and completely unknown just a town over. Their badges, though, often persisted, worn as tokens of home rather than marks of official pilgrimage. Outside, the crickets have started up, chirping in lazy counterpoint to the creak of the chapel's beams. Someone produces a flute, badly tuned, heroically played, and you find yourself smiling despite the ache in your back. As the stars emerge in their slow, ancient dance, you unroll your blanket near the hearth. You lay your cloak over yourself. The badges cool against your skin. They settle like coins in a shallow fountain, each one glinting softly in the low light. A few of them snag on the blanket, so you rearrange them, pressing the edges down with the flat of your palm. quirky tidbit. Some pilgrims believed their badges had protective powers when slept under, like medieval dream catchers. Others thought the metal absorbed blessings from shrines and might pass those blessings to you in your sleep. There's even one 14th century account of a man who swore his Compostela badge cured his gout, though some suspect that may have had more to do with the wine-soaked journey home. A gentle rain begins outside. Not a storm, not even a drizzle, really. More a sigh from the sky. You close your eyes. The chapel smells of wood smoke and wax. Your belly is only half full, but it's enough. The hard floor under you feels almost soft compared to a ditch. You drift off briefly and wake later to find a badge seller quietly unpacking a few spare pins by the chapel door. You watch him work. Delicate fingers smoothing each badge with a cloth, arranging them into rows that catch the moonlight. He glances up and sees you watching. "Never too late to add one more," he whispers. You smile, reach into your pouch, and trade him a badge shaped like a tiny fish for one that looks suspiciously like a loaf of bread. There's no saint's name, no shrine named, just bread. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it's more than enough. He tucks the fish into his sleeve and nods. "Safe journey," he says, "and keep your badges dry." You nod back and close your eyes again, this time surrendering fully to the chapel's hush. The floor creaks. The badges rustle. A soft wind curls through the door, brushing your face like the hand of someone who once cared deeply for you. Outside, the road waits, but not tonight. Tonight, you rest with your badges, your strange little army of memories. Each one pressed close, whispering stories in their quiet, tinny voices. Morning creeps in slowly, like a cat testing the air with one cautious paw. You stir under your blanket as the chapel stirs with you. Pilgrims rising, stretching, murmuring their half-dreamed prayers and yawns in equal measure. The fire is long gone, leaving only the scent of ash and old wood. You blink up at the stone ceiling, and for a moment you forget where you are. But then you shift, and the telltale weight of your badges reminds you. Right. Still a pilgrim, still very much in the business of walking long distances in medieval shoes. You rise quietly, careful not to wake the monk who is now curled up in a way that can only be described as monastically uncomfortable. You gather your things, pin your latest badge, the bread-shaped one, to your cloak, and step outside into a gentle fog. The road is slick but manageable. Your boots squelch softly as you rejoin the trail, the landscape hushed and softened by the mist. You pass other pilgrims along the way. Some you recognize, others are new. One man carries a carved staff nearly as tall as he is, its top adorned with badges that chime like wind bells. Another walks barefoot, her cloak completely covered in cloth badges stitched with patient, loving detail. One depicts a fish with a crown, another shows a snail riding a goat. You choose not to ask. Mainstream historical fact. Cloth badges were often an alternative to metal ones, especially for poorer pilgrims or those traveling long distances. These were easier to transport, less likely to be stolen, and could be sewn directly onto clothing. Some were dyed, others embroidered. Many were made to be burned with the owner upon their death, as proof, they hoped, of a life spent in piety. As the sun rises, the fog begins to lift, revealing the rolling countryside ahead. You pass fields where peasants are already working, backs bent and hands dirty. A child waves to you, and you wave back, badge clinking. One village you enter is holding a market day. You're drawn to the smell of roasting onions and barley bread. You trade a small wooden charm you've been carrying for a wedge of cheese that doesn't quite look legal, and tuck it away for later. The badge sellers are out, too, this time with rarer stock. A tiny boot for St. Crispin, a donkey for St. Anthony, a badge shaped like a crescent moon, rumored to come from a chapel deep in the Pyrenees, where the Virgin was said to have once wept. A badge seller sees your collection and whistles. "You're not just wandering, friend, you're documenting." You shrug. Maybe you are. Every badge you carry is more than a souvenir. They're tiny memoirs, evidence of your feet, your prayers, your blisters, and your very odd conversations with strangers. Quirky tidbit. Some pilgrims reportedly mailed badges home to loved ones who couldn't travel. Early medieval postcards, in a way. These would sometimes be sewn into wedding garments, birth swaddles, or even burial shrouds. A sort of long-distance pilgrimage by proxy, with the badge doing the holy walking on your behalf. Historians still argue whether such practices were officially sanctioned or just enthusiastically tolerated. The line between superstition, piety, and practicality was often very blurry in the medieval world. And sometimes, people just liked shiny things that had stories attached to them. You stop by a well to fill your flask, and the village priest, who is suspiciously good at salesmanship, asks if you'd like a blessing. You agree. He taps your head with a sprig of rosemary, mutters something in Latin that may or may not have been improvised, and pats your badge-covered shoulder. "Walk lightly," he says, "and if you must sin, do it politely." That makes you laugh, a little too loudly, drawing stares from a few passing nuns. You apologize. One of them winks. You keep moving. The road is dry now, and your steps are quicker. There's an ease to your gait you didn't have days ago. You're still sore, still footsore, still vaguely annoyed by the badge near your elbow that keeps snagging on things. But you feel better, calmer. Maybe it's the rhythm. Maybe it's the sense that each badge you wear has turned your body into a kind of living map. Not of places, but of people you met, moments you survived, meals you devoured too quickly and regretted shortly after. And chapels, always chapels, where you laid down and let the badges tell their silent, metallic stories to the night. A gentle wind rises. It smells of thyme, wet stone, and something sweet. Plums, maybe. You turn a bend and see the spires of your final shrine in the distance. They rise like dark teeth above the trees, swaying slightly in the heat haze. You don't rush, you just keep walking. Because you know the final badge is waiting. You don't know its shape or what tail it will carry. Only that it will be yours, and only yours. Eventually you reach the gates. You kneel, not because you have to, but because your knees give out, and frankly, they're calling the shots now. The gatekeeper, a young woman with ink-stained hands, nods at your cloak. "Quite the collection," she says. You smile. "All earned." She opens the gate and lets you through. You enter, you breathe, you smile again. You are home, and now, as the final chapel door closes gently behind you, we'll leave the road behind too. Let the soft clinking of your badges grow quiet, fading into the hush of distant bells and slow footsteps. The journey has carried you far, from muddy paths and smoky taverns to windy hillsides and starlit sanctuaries, and every step has brought with it a story, folded quietly into the fabric of your cloak. The world beyond those medieval roads may seem distant now, but its rhythms still hum beneath our modern pace. Pilgrims still walk, in ways both visible and unseen, and stories, just like those pressed pewter tokens, still pass from hand to hand, shimmering with strange meaning in the quiet dark. So, let yourself sink deeper now, into the soft weight of your blanket, into the hush of your room, into the calm certainty that the world has always been a little silly, a little sacred, and filled with small, quiet souvenirs for those who choose to notice. Let the last badge rest gently on your chest. Let the flickering candle of thought soften to a quiet glow. There's nowhere else to be, nothing left to carry. Just rest now, Just breathe. You've walked far enough for one night. Good night.